There is a document resting in the climate-controlled silence of the British Library's private vaults that no historian is permitted to quote. It is a thick, leather-bound volume from the year 1842, wrapped in stained vellum and smelling of copper and dry rot. For over a century, the East India Company kept this ledger classified under a seal of high treason. It was not a record of gold, tea, or silk. It was something far more sinister. It was a soul ledger. Inside its yellowed pages, the most powerful corporation in human history meticulously calculated the exact hours of sleep stolen from millions of subjects. They did not just colonize the land. They colonized the human subconscious. This was the ultimate moral decay, a secret tax on the very act of dreaming. The ink used to record these debts was mixed with a blue-black extract that changed color, under the flicker of a candle, revealing the names of families who had been robbed of their nights. This is a story of a profound betrayal, a forbidden truth buried beneath layers of corporate lies and royal silence. The world believes the company traded in spice, but their true currency was the human spirit. This is the truth the king buried. Now let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe in the stillness of this moment. Let the weight of the day fall away as we descend into the year 1842. The world outside is cold and raining, but here, by the hearth, the fire provides a soft, rhythmic pulse. We are stepping into a time of shadows and secrets, where the ink is still wet and the truth is waiting to be heard. To understand the ledger of 1842, one must first understand the atmosphere of London during the height of the Victorian era. It was a city of perpetual fog, where the sun was a rare visitor and the streets were illuminated by the hiss of gaslights. The headquarters of the East India Company stood on Leadenhall Street, a massive stone monolith that breathed with the cold logic of profit. Inside this building, men in high collars sat behind heavy mahogany desks, deciding the fate of nations they would never visit. But in the autumn of that year, a specific room in the basement became the center of a project so secret that even the board of directors spoke of it only in whispers. This was the Department of Intangible Assets. It was a small, windowless office where the walls were lined with thousands of identical blue ledgers. These were the precursors to the one found today. The year 1842 marked a turning point in human history, not because of a war won or a territory gained, but because of a discovery made in the poppy fields of the East. The company had found a way to bridge the gap between commerce and the human mind. They had developed a substance known in the private journals as the blue poppy extract. While the rest of the world saw opium as a simple drug for pain or recreation, the company's private alchemists saw it as a key. They discovered that when processed in a specific candlelit environment, the extract allowed them to harvest the energy of the human REM cycle. Sleep is the only part of the human experience that cannot be truly owned. It is a private sanctuary, where the mind processes its fears, hopes, and memories. For the East India Company, this was an untapped resource. If they could tax a man's grain and his salt, why could they not tax his rest? The ledger of 1842 was the first official accounting of this harvest. If you were to look at the first page of this ledger, you would see a list of names from the Bengal presidency. Next to each name is a column marked hours subtracted. These were not hours of labor in a field or a factory. These were hours of deep, restorative sleep that had been chemically or psychologically diverted. The ledger suggests that by inducing a state of perpetual anxiety, and using the blue poppy extract in the local water supplies, the company could effectively keep a population in a state of twilight. In this state, the subjects were productive enough to work, but they lacked the mental clarity to dream of rebellion. The informative depth of this discovery is staggering. Historians have often wondered why certain colonial populations remained so passive during periods of extreme hardship. The ledger of 1842 provides a chilling answer. They were not just physically tired. They were being systematically deprived of the neurological processing that occurs during sleep. The company had turned the human brain into a biological battery, extracting the creative and emotional energy that normally fuels the human spirit. As we sit in the quiet of this room, imagine the sheer scale of this operation. Millions of individuals, each losing 2 to 3 hours of their most vital rest every single night. The ledger calculates this as a surplus of human energy that was then shipped back to London. But how does one ship sleep? This is where the story moves from the realm of economics into the realm of the forbiddance. The company's researchers, led by a man known only as Dr. Aristone, believed that the subconscious mind produced a subtle electrical charge during deep sleep. By using specialized copper-lined rooms in their colonial outposts, they claimed to be able to capture this charge. It was then stored in glass jars filled with a heavy metallic liquid. These jars were labeled as spices or medicinal oils to avoid suspicion during the long voyage across the oceans. When these jars reached London, they were taken to the Department of Intangible Assets. There, the energy was released into the private chambers of the British elite. It was said that the directors of the company never looked tired. Even in their 70s and 80s, their eyes were bright and their minds were sharp. They were living on the borrowed time of 1,000 distant souls. The moral decay of this system is evident in every entry of the ledger. There is a section dedicated to children. The company found that the sleep of a child was much more potent than that of an adult. It contained a higher concentration of imaginative energy. The ledger notes that the children of the weaving districts in India were particularly valuable. Their dreams were vivid, colorful, and full of life. By harvesting these dreams, the company's alchemists believed they could create a permanent state of mental clarity for the ruling class. But there was a side effect that the ledger records in clinical cold detail. Those whose sleep was harvested began to suffer from a condition known as the hollow eye. They became shadows of themselves. They could perform simple tasks, but they could no longer feel joy or anger. They were the perfect subjects for a corporate empire. They were workers who did not dream of a better world because they had lost the ability to dream entirely. As we continue our journey through the corridors of 1842, the rain outside the Leadenhall headquarters turns to a steady, rhythmic drumming against the window panes. Inside the ledger, the records become more specific. We see the names of English clerks and dock workers appearing alongside the colonial subjects. The company had realized that the sole ledger did not need to be restricted to the East. The hunger for vitality was growing, and the supply from the colonies was no longer enough to satisfy the appetites of the London boardrooms. The ledger details a secret experiment conducted in the East End of London. Under the guise of a public health initiative, the company distributed a new type of tea, fortified with what they called the Himalayan essence. In reality, it was the same blue poppy extract refined for the European palate. Within weeks, the residents of the Docklands began to report a strange phenomenon. They would wake up feeling as though they had never slept at all. despite being unconscious for 8 hours. The company's internal reports, tucked between the pages of the ledger, describe the results as highly successful. The productivity of the dock workers increased by 20%. They worked with a machine-like precision, their movements synchronized and devoid of hesitation. But the reports also note a rising trend in silent staring. Men would stand for hours looking at the Thames, their eyes open but their minds seemingly absent. They were physically present, but the essence of their nights had been moved to the ledger. Dr. Aristone's notes in the ledger become increasingly obsessed with the idea of the collective subconscious. He theorized that if the company could harvest enough sleep from enough people, they could effectively create a mastermind, a single, focused consciousness that could predict market trends and political shifts years in advance. This was not just about personal health anymore. It was about the ultimate control of time and destiny. The ledger of 1842 contains a map of London, but it is not a map of streets and buildings. It is a map of sleep density. The areas around the company's warehouses are marked in deep purple, indicating a high rate of harvest. The areas around the parks and the wealthy estates are marked in gold, indicating where the harvested energy was being released. It was a literal redistribution of human life. The poor were paying for the immortality of the rich with the only thing they had left, their dreams. Consider the informative weight of this reality. In the 1840s, the Industrial Revolution was at its peak. History tells us that this was a time of great progress and technological advancement. But the ledger suggests that this progress was fueled by a stolen mental resource. The inventions of the era, the steam engine, the telegraph, the massive iron bridges, were perhaps not the result of natural genius alone, but the result of minds that were artificially boosted by the stolen rest of millions. As you listen to the steady breath of the night, think about the ledger's description of the harvest process itself. It was described as a gentle siphoning. The subjects would feel a slight coolness at the back of their necks as they drifted off to sleep. This was the sensation of the copper coils hidden within the bed frames provided by the company-owned housing, beginning to pull the REM energy away. The ledger notes that the most effective harvest happened between the hours of 2 and 4 in the morning, the time known as the Wolf hour. This is when the veil between the conscious and the subconscious is at its thinnest. The entries in the ledger are written in a script that seems to shimmer. Some researchers believe the ink contains crushed crystals that react to the electromagnetic energy of the words themselves. When you read the names of the victims, you feel a faint echo of their exhaustion. It is a heavy, weighted feeling, like walking through water. This is the psychological layer of the ledger. It is not just a record. It is a vessel. It holds the residual fatigue of an entire era. The moral decay of the company officials is documented through their personal requisitions. One director, a man named Sir Josiah, requested a double dose of the essence for his daughter's wedding. He wanted the guests to feel a level of euphoria and clarity that was physically impossible for human beings to achieve naturally. The ledger records that the energy for this event was taken from a specific village in the Bihar province. For 3 nights, not a single person in that village closed their eyes. They stood in their fields, paralyzed by a waking insomnia, while 1,000 miles away, the London elite danced in a state of celestial grace. This is the betrayal of the human condition. The East India Company had found the one thing that was supposed to be free, and they turned it into a commodity. They created a market for the intangible. They understood that a man who cannot dream is a man who cannot hope, and a man who cannot hope is a man who is easy to rule. The ledger of 1842 is the blueprint for this silence dot. As the night grows deeper and the shadows in our room stretch longer, we reach the final sections of the ledger. The year 1842 was nearing its end, and the experiment was reaching a breaking point. The moral decay had begun to infect even the harvesters themselves. The eunuchs and clerks who managed the copper coils and the silver jars began to report visions. They were seeing the dreams they were stealing. The ledger records a terrifying phenomenon known as the bleed, because the human mind is not meant to be a storage vessel for foreign energy. The harvested dreams began to leak into the minds of the company employees. A clerk in London would suddenly have a vivid memory of a monsoon in a land he had never seen. A director would wake up screaming, his mind filled with the grief of a mother from a distant continent, whose child's sleep had been taken. The boundaries of the self were dissolving. The company had sought to own the subconscious, but they had forgotten that the subconscious is a vast, interconnected ocean. By stealing from the collective, they had invited the collective into their own heads. The ledger notes that several high-ranking officials were committed to private asylums in late 1842. They were found babbling in languages they didn't speak, their eyes wide with the stolen sights of 10,000 different lives. This was the hidden reason for the sudden restructuring of the East India Company in the following years. It wasn't just political pressure or economic shifts. It was a desperate attempt to stop the bleed. The board of directors ordered the destruction of the copper coils and the burial of the silver jars, but the ledger survived. It was kept as a warning, a record of the time when the company almost lost its own mind to the very resource it tried to exploit. The final pages of the ledger are written in a hurried, trembling hand. The ink is no longer blue-black. It is a pale, ghostly gray. The writer, likely Dr. Aristone himself, concludes with a chilling reflection. He writes that while the physical harvest had stopped, the debt remained. The hours of sleep taken in 1842 had never been returned. They exist somewhere in the fabric of time, a massive deficit of rest that the world has been trying to pay back ever since. He suggests that the modern pace of life, the feeling of perpetual exhaustion that haunts our century, is the lingering echo of the soul ledger. We are born into a world that is already tired because the very foundation of our rest was mortgaged by the company over 100 years ago. This is the informative core of the story, the idea that our current psychological state is a historical inheritance. We are living in the shadow of a corporate heist that took place before our great-grandparents were born. As we close the ledger in our minds, let the weight of this knowledge settle into the stillness. The fire in the hearth is now just a collection of glowing embers, casting a soft, warm light over the room. The history we are told is a history of kings and wars, but the history that matters is the one written in the ledgers of our own souls. The East India Company may be gone, but the philosophy of the harvest remains. We are constantly pressured to give up our rest for the sake of productivity, to trade our dreams for the progress of the machine. The ledger of 1842 serves as a reminder that our sleep is a sacred territory. It is the one place where the company cannot follow us, provided we guard the gates, listen to the silence of the night. It is a vast, open space waiting to be filled with your own thoughts, your own images, and your own peace. The ledger is a closed book now. Its secrets are out, and its power is faded. The debt of 1842 is a ghost, and like all ghosts, It loses its strength in the light of awareness. You are safe now in the sanctuary of the present. The fog of Victorian London has cleared, and the copper coils have long since turned to dust. The nights are yours once again. The dreams you have tonight belong only to you. They are a gift, a biological necessity, and a quiet rebellion against a world that never sleeps. As you drift closer to the edge of rest, remember that the most informative thing we can know is the value of our own inner life. The company tried to put a price on it, but they failed. They were consumed by their own greed, lost in a maze of stolen reflections. You, however, are whole. Your mind is your own. Your rest is a boundless ocean, calm and deep. The story of the ledger ends here, but your story continues in the quiet hours ahead. The world is still, the air is cool, and the bed is a place of total security. Let your eyes close and let the last of the candlelit shadows disappear. There's no more debt to pay. There are no more hours to account for. There is only the soft, rhythmic pull of the deep as the last embers of the 1842 mystery fade. A new shadow begins to stir in the archives. While the company was stealing dreams in the East, a different kind of darkness was brewing in the heart of Europa. Secret society that believed they could live inside the very mirrors that watched the aristocracy. But that is a story for another night, when the moon is thin and the glass is cold. For now, let the silence be your guide. The history books tell you that the Great Smog of London was a mere byproduct of the Industrial Revolution, a simple mixture of coal smoke and river mist. They are lying to you. In the winter of 1842, the fog that descended upon the capital was not gray. It was a deep, unnatural indigo. This was not a weather event. It was a shroud. The East India Company had perfected a method of atmospheric containment, a chemical veil designed to keep the citizens of London in a state of suggestible lethargy. While the common man coughed in the streets, the board of directors sat in the silence of Leadenhall Street, watching the city disappear into a violet haze. This was the ultimate betrayal of the public trust, a forbidden experiment where the very air was weaponized to dampen the human spirit. They called it the London Particular, but it was a curse designed to mask the sounds of the Soul Ledger's collection. The screams of the subconscious were muffled by the thickness of the indigo air. Thousands walked these streets like ghosts, unaware that their thoughts were being harvested behind the heavy stone walls of the company headquarters. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe slowly and feel the cool dampness of a Victorian evening settling around you. We are stepping out of the light and into the heart of the indigo fog. The world is becoming soft, blurred, and distant. To walk the streets of London in 1842 was to walk through a dream that had turned sour. The cobblestones of Leadenhall Street were slick with a residue that felt like oil but looked like crushed velvet under the gaslights. If you were there, you would notice that the lamps did not pierce the darkness as they should. Instead, the light seemed to be swallowed by the fog, creating small, flickering islands of orange in a sea of deep purple. This was the Indigo Fog, the physical manifestation of the company's greed. The East India House was the center of this darkness. It was a massive, imposing structure, its neoclassical columns standing like the ribs of a prehistoric beast. Inside, the air was different. It was unnaturally still, devoid of the soot and noise of the city. The clerks moved with a rhythmic, hypnotic grace, their footsteps silent on the thick Persian rugs. Every room was illuminated by a single, massive beeswax candle, casting long, dancing shadows that seemed to have a life of their own. In this environment, time began to lose its meaning. The company had created a microcosm where the laws of the outside world did not apply. The indigo fog outside served a dual purpose. It kept the prying eyes of the public away from the headquarters, and it acted as a medium for the transmission of the stolen energy. The alchemists in the basement labs had discovered that the blue poppy extract, when vaporized, could hold a charge of human intention. By releasing this vapor into the London air, they created a massive, citywide circuit. You might wonder how a city of millions could fail to notice such a profound change. The answer lies in the nature of the indigo itself. The color was chosen because it sits at the edge of human perception. It is a color that suggests depth and infinity, but it also induces a state of calm, almost catatonic peace. The people of London did not complain about the fog because the fog made them forget how to complain. It was a psychological sedative delivered through every breath they took. As you listen to the sound of the distant city in your mind, imagine the silence of the docks. The Thames was a river of liquid shadow, its surface undisturbed by the heavy barges that moved like funeral carriages through the mist. The sailors spoke in hushed tones, if they spoke at all. They felt the weight of the indigo on their skin, a subtle pressure that made their limbs feel heavy and their minds feel light. This was the atmosphere of a city under siege, not by an army, but by a corporation. The corporate headquarters was not just an office, it was a cathedral of commerce. Every decision made within its walls was calculated to maximize the yield of the soul ledger. The directors understood that a chaotic city was a difficult city to harvest. By imposing the indigo fog, they imposed a collective order. They turned the vibrant, messy life of Victorian London into a subdued, predictable machine. The darkness began here, in the ledgers and the laboratory flasks, but it spread through the chimneys and the sewer grates until it permeated every brick and every soul. The architecture of the East India House was designed to reflect power, but its true purpose was resonance. The hollow chambers beneath the floorboards were tuned to specific frequencies that amplified the effects of the indigo vapor. If you were to place your ear against the cold stone of the foundation, you would hear a low, constant hum. This was the heartbeat of the company, a mechanical pulse that synchronized the breathing of everyone within a 5-mile radius. It was a masterstroke of psychological engineering, ensuring that the population was literally in tune with the corporate will. Within the corporate halls, the moral decay was palpable. The high-ranking officials began to exhibit strange behaviors. They developed an aversion to natural sunlight, spending their days in rooms where the shutters were permanently closed. They claimed the sun was too loud, a sensory overload that interfered with their connection to the ledger. They preferred the indigo light, the soft violet glow that emanated from the silver jars stored in the vaults. They were becoming creatures of the fog, losing their humanity in exchange for a distorted version of enlightenment. The informative depth of this era is often overlooked by mainstream researchers. We look at the architectural grandness of the Victorian period and see it as a sign of progress. But look closer at the designs of the time. The sudden obsession with heavy velvet curtains, the darkened parlors, and the intricate, labyrinthine layouts of the homes. These were defensive measures. The public was subconsciously trying to create sanctuaries where the indigo could not reach. They were building cocoons of fabric and wood to protect the last remnants of their private thoughts. Even the art of the period began to reflect the indigo influence. Painters who were once known for their bright landscapes suddenly shifted to nocturnal scenes, where the subjects were obscured by layers of shadow and mist. They were painting the reality they lived in, a world where clarity was a forgotten luxury. The fog was not just in the air, it was in the eyes of the beholder. It was a filter that colored every interaction, every dream, and every memory. The psychological layer of this story is found in the journals of the common people. A seamstress in Spitalfields wrote of a dream she had every night for a month. In the dream, she was weaving a shroud for the entire city, but the thread was made of her own hair. When she woke up, her room was filled with the scent of the blue poppy, and her hair was brittle and gray. She was a victim of the harvest, her creative energy siphoned off to power the ambitions of men she would never meet. These stories are not in the official archives, but they are etched into the walls of the city itself. Why did the company risk such a dangerous experiment? The answer is found in the looming threat of social unrest. The mid-19th century was a time of revolution across Europe. The ruling class was terrified of the masses. The Indigo Fog was their ultimate solution. It was a non-violent weapon, a way to disarm a population without firing a single shot. By controlling the atmosphere, they controlled the very possibility of dissent. You cannot revolt if you cannot remember why you are angry. You cannot strike if you cannot find your way to the factory gates. As the fog thickened, the city became a place of whispers. People moved through the streets like sleepwalkers, their eyes fixed on the ground. The social fabric of London began to unravel, replaced by a cold corporate efficiency. Neighbors stopped talking to one another. Families sat in silence around their dinner tables, the indigo vapor creeping in through the cracks in the doors. The darkness had moved from the headquarters into the hearth, and from the hearth into the heart, the final stage of the Indigo Fog's deployment was the introduction of the great bells. These were not the bells of churches, but massive bronze instruments installed atop the East India House and several key warehouses along the Thames. They were struck only once a day at the stroke of midnight. The sound was not a chime, but a deep, vibrating thrum that shook the very air. This was the signal for the harvest to begin in earnest. When the great bells rang, the indigo vapor reached its maximum density, creating a literal wall of fog that cut off London from the rest of the world for several hours. During these hours of total indigo, the company's collectors would move through the streets. They wore long, black coats and masks made of treated leather to filter the air. They carried small, copper rods that glowed with a faint blue light. They did not need to enter homes. They simply walked past the windows, the rods acting as magnets for the displaced energy of the sleeping inhabitants. The ledger of 1842 recorded the yield of these nightly walks in meticulous detail. A single street in Southwark could provide enough energy to power a director's mental acuity. For an entire week. The informative reality of this process is chilling when you consider the long-term effects on the city's population. The indigo did more than just sedate, it altered the neurological pathways of those who lived within it. Generations of Londoners were born and raised in the violet haze, their brains adapting to a world of muted colors and dampened emotions. This is perhaps why the Victorian character is often described as stoic and reserved. It was not a cultural choice. It was a physiological adaptation to a corporate toxin. The moral decay reached its zenith when the company began to export the indigo vapor to other colonial capitals. They realized that the fog was a universal tool for governance. From Calcutta to Hong Kong, the indigo started to appear always under the guise of local weather patterns or industrial smoke. The East India Company was no longer just a trading firm. It was an atmospheric architect, reshaping the world in the image of its own dark ambitions. But even the most sophisticated systems have flaws. The Indigo Fog required a constant supply of the blue poppy extract, and the logistics of this were becoming increasingly difficult. The alchemists in the basement labs began to notice that the vapor was becoming unstable. It was starting to consume itself, drawing energy not just from the public, but from the structures of the city. Bricks began to crumble prematurely. Iron railings rusted overnight. The city was literally rotting from the inside out, sacrificed on the altar of corporate control. As we look back at the London of 1842, we must ask ourselves how much of that fog still lingers. The East India Company eventually fell, its power stripped away by the crown and the tides of history. But the architecture of control they pioneered did not disappear. It merely evolved. The Indigo Fog was the first attempt at mass psychological management, a precursor to the digital and chemical veils of the modern age. We are the descendants of those who walked through the violet mist, and perhaps we still carry a bit of that indigo in our own blood. The streets of London are clear now, or so they seem. The great bells are silent, and the East India House has been replaced by modern glass towers. But on certain cold, damp nights, when the moon is hidden and the river mist rises, you can still see a hint of purple in the air. You can still feel that old, heavy stillness that makes you want to close your eyes and forget. This is the lingering ghost of the company, a reminder that the darkness never truly leaves. It only waits for the next ledger to be opened. The story of the fog is a story of what happens when we stop paying attention to the air we breathe and the thoughts we think. It is a warning about the high price of comfort and the hidden cost of progress. The East India Company proved that you can own a person without ever touching them, simply by owning the environment in which they exist. They turned a city into a laboratory and its citizens into subjects, all while the world watched and saw nothing but smoke. As the night continues to hold us in its gentle embrace. Let the memory of the indigo serve as a shield. Be aware of the veils that are placed before your eyes. Value the clarity of your own mind and the sanctity of your own rest. The fog can only exist where there is a lack of light. By acknowledging the secret, you begin to dissipate the mist. You are no longer a ghost in the street. You are awake in the silence, but while the city was lost in the indigo, a deeper secret was being prepared in the very labs that created the fog. The alchemists had found something in the blue poppy that they could not control. A chemical signature that pointed toward a ritual far older than the company itself. They called it the Blue Poppy Protocol, and it was the key to unlocking the Soul Ledger's final, most terrifying secret. The fog was just the beginning. The true ritual was about to be revealed. Every history student in the Western world is taught the story of the opium wars as a simple conflict of trade and silver. They are told it was a war of commodities, a struggle for economic dominance between the British Empire and the Qing dynasty. This is a carefully constructed lie. The opium shipped by the East India Company was never the final product. It was merely the raw material for something far more terrifying. Deep within the fortified laboratories of Calcutta and the hidden mountain retreats of the Himalayas, the company's private alchemists were executing the Blue Poppy Protocol. They had discovered that a specific, rare mutation of the poppy plant, when grown in soil enriched with ancient minerals, produced a resin that did not just dull the senses. It acted as a bridge between human subconscious minds. This was a forbidden science, a betrayal of the very boundaries of the individual soul. The protocol was not designed to create addicts, but to create a connected network of human spirits that could be harvested and monitored from a central corporate hub. This was the ultimate violation, a secret buried under layers of official records and diplomatic distractions. The company didn't want your silver. They wanted to own the pathway to your internal world. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe deeply and feel the cool, still air of a long-forgotten archive settling around you. We are leaving the noise of the modern world behind and stepping into the flickering candlelight of 1842. The world is slow, rhythmic and heavy with secrets. To understand the Blue Poppy Protocol, one must first visualize the fields where this hidden history began. Imagine a valley in the high mountains, where the air is thin and the stars seem close enough to touch. Here, the poppies were not the familiar red of the battlefield. They were a deep, shimmering indigo, a color that seemed to pulse with a low, internal light. These were the blue poppies, a botanical anomaly that the East India Company spent decades cultivating in total secrecy. The company's lead researcher, a man whose name has been scrubbed from every public ledger, wrote in his private journals that the blue poppy was a plant that fed on memory. It didn't just draw nutrients from the earth. It drew the residual psychic energy of the land itself. When the resin was harvested at the precise moment of the lunar eclipse, it contained a substance the alchemists called the vital trace. This was the core of the protocol. In the laboratories beneath the company's regional headquarters, the atmosphere was one of clinical silence and suppressed dread. The windows were shielded with heavy lead plates to prevent any interference from the outside world. The only light came from specialized oil lamps that burned with a steady blue flame. Here, the indigo resin was refined through a process of multiple distillations, each step designed to strip away the narcotic properties and concentrate the psychic resonance. The informative reality of this process is far more complex than a simple drug manufacture. The alchemists used copper cooling coils and glass retorts etched with geometric patterns that were believed to focus the energy of the resin. They weren't just making a substance. They were crafting a tool for psychological conquest. The final product was a clear, viscous liquid that remained stable only in total darkness. The East India Company's board of directors viewed this liquid as the ultimate strategic asset. If they could distribute it to a population, they could effectively bypass the need for physical force. The Blue Poppy Protocol was a plan for a silent occupation. By introducing the refined extract into the local trade networks under the guise of medicinal wine or luxury tea, they could establish a mental link with every person who consumed it. Imagine the psychological implications of such a connection. It was not a form of mind control in the traditional sense. It was more subtle. It allowed the company to broadcast a state of quietude and compliance directly into the collective subconscious. It was like a low-frequency hum that existed just below the level of conscious thought, a persistent suggestion that rebellion was futile and the company's rule was as natural as the weather. As you lie there in the stillness, think about the scale of this ambition. The company was attempting to build a global nervous system with London at its center. Every subject in the colonies, every worker in the fields, and every merchant in the ports would be a node in this invisible network. The blue poppy resin was the conductive wire that made it all possible. It was a corporate empire that extended into the very dreams of its subjects. The moral decay of the men who designed this protocol is documented in their internal correspondence. They spoke of human beings as biomass, as resources to be optimized and synchronized. They had completely abandoned the idea of individual agency in favor of a collective efficiency that benefited only the shareholders. This was a world where a man's thoughts were no longer his own, but were part of a vast corporate ledger. The implementation of the Blue Poppy Protocol required a logistical feat that has never been equaled in the history of global trade. The East India Company created a fleet of ghost ships, vessels that were not listed on any official shipping manifest. These ships were painted in matte black and moved only under the cover of the Indigo Fog we discussed before. Their holds were not filled with crates of tea or bales of cotton, but with reinforced silver canisters containing the refined blue poppy extract. These canisters were handled with a level of reverence usually reserved for religious icons. The sailors who manned these ghost ships were chosen for their lack of imagination and their high tolerance for isolation. They were told they were carrying a secret volatile fuel, a lie that kept them from prying into the containers. But even so, the sailors often reported strange phenomena. They would wake up and realize they had all had the exact same dream of a vast blue ocean where the waves were made of liquid silk and a single giant eye watched them from the sky. This was the first sign of the protocol's power. Even in its contained form, the resin was starting to synchronize the minds of those near it. When the ships arrived at their destinations, the extract was moved into the local water supplies of the major trading hubs. This was done with the cooperation of local officials who had already been compromised by the company's influence. The informative depth of these operations reveals a level of corruption that reached into every layer of society. As the population began to consume the tainted water, the psychological landscape of the colonies began to change. The vibrant, often chaotic energy of the marketplaces was replaced by a strange, rhythmic order. People moved in unison, without a word being spoken. The air itself seemed to vibrate with a low, constant frequency. This was the Blue Poppy Protocol in its active phase. The company had successfully established a subconscious bridge, but the directors in London were not satisfied with mere compliance. They wanted to use the bridge to extract information. They believed that the human subconscious contained a wealth of untapped knowledge, historical secrets, and creative breakthroughs that were normally locked away. By using the Blue Poppy network, they could harvest this information during the hours of sleep. They were not just stealing time. They were mining the collective wisdom of entire civilizations. Think about the psychological toll on a person who is being mined in this way. They would wake up feeling a profound sense of loss, as if something essential had been taken from them, but they wouldn't have the words to describe what it was. They would feel hollow, a shell of a person whose internal treasures had been relocated to a corporate vault in London. This is the ultimate form of colonial extraction. The protocol also included a defensive mechanism. If any individual within the network began to show signs of resistance or independent thought that threatened the company's interests, the bridge could be used to isolate and dampen those thoughts. It was a psychological prison with no walls and no guards. The prisoner was held captive by the very chemistry of their own brain. The informative records of the era suggest that the company even used the Blue Poppy Protocol to influence the decisions of rival nations. By sending gift shipments of refined goods to the courts of Europe, they could subtly shift the diplomatic consensus in their favor. A king who was once a fierce opponent of The company's expansion would suddenly find himself feeling a strange sense of peace and agreement whenever their representatives were in the room. The moral decay of this era is perhaps most evident in the way the company treated its own employees. The alchemists and clerks who worked on the protocol were eventually required to consume the resin themselves. The company wanted to ensure total loyalty, and what better way than to link their minds to the corporate core? These men became the first true corporate citizens, individuals whose identities were entirely subsumed by the entity they served. As you breathe in the quiet of the night, consider the silence of those who lived under the protocol. It was a silence of the mind, a stillness that was not the peace of natural rest, but the stillness of a machine that has been paused. The blue poppy was the oil that kept the gears of the empire turning, and the human subconscious was the engine that provided the power. The company's arrogance was their downfall. They believed they could control the ocean of the human spirit without being drowned by it. They didn't realize that the bridge worked both ways. While they were extracting thoughts from the people's collective grief and suffering were beginning to flow back toward the center. The bridge was starting to carry a burden of pain that the corporate structure was never designed to hold. The final phase of the Blue Poppy Protocol was intended to be the permanent integration of the global subconscious. The East India Company's alchemists had designed a massive resonant chamber in the heart of London, a structure made of specialized alloys that would act as a beacon for the entire network. If successful, this would have created a single, unified consciousness under corporate control. It was the ultimate dream of the empire, a world where the sun never set on the company's mind. But as the resonance began to build, the feedback from the bridge became overwhelming. The collective subconscious of millions of people is not a passive resource. It is a living, breathing force of nature. The grief of the mothers, the anger of the oppressed, and the exhaustion of the laborers all began to pulse through the silver canisters and the copper coils. The alchemists in the basement labs were the first to feel it. They were hit by a wave of emotional intensity that shattered their mental defenses. The informative journals from the end of 1842 describe a scene of total psychological collapse within the company headquarters. Men were found weeping for children they never had, shouting in languages they had never learned, and feeling the physical pain of injuries they had never suffered. The bridge had become a conduit for the collective trauma of the empire. The moral decay had finally caught up with the architects of the protocol. The directors in London attempted to cut the connection, but the blue poppy resin had a life of its own. It had become a self-sustaining psychic organism. The only way to stop the feedback was to physically destroy the canisters in the resonant chamber. This led to a series of unexplained fires and accidents at company facilities across the globe. These events were reported in the newspapers as industrial mishaps, but they were actually desperate attempts to break the link. Even after the physical destruction, the effects of the protocol lingered. The bridge had left a permanent scar on the human subconscious. People who had been part of the network continued to experience fragments of other people's lives. This is perhaps the origin of many modern psychological phenomena: the sense of déjà vu, the unexplained feeling of someone else's presence, and the collective anxieties that seem to sweep through society for no reason. The Blue Poppy Protocol was the first and most ambitious attempt to industrialize the human soul. It proved that while you can manipulate the body and control the land, the spirit is a territory that cannot be occupied forever. The East India Company's failure was a victory for human individuality, though it came at a terrible price. The secrets of the blue poppy were buried, and the resin was declared a forbidden substance, but the knowledge of what they did remains in the shadows of our history, as we lie in the safety of our own time. We must recognize that the desire for such control has not vanished. The methods have changed, but the goal remains the same. The corporate entities of today may not use indigo resin and silver canisters, but they still seek to build bridges into our internal worlds. They still view our attention, our data, and our dreams as commodities to be harvested. The Blue Poppy Protocol is a cautionary tale for the modern age. The informative depth of this story is meant to awaken a sense of vigilance. Our rest is our own. Our subconscious is the last true wilderness, a place where no company should be allowed to build a bridge. By understanding the history of the protocol, we can better protect the sanctity of our own minds. We can refuse to be nodes in a network and choose to be individuals in a world of our own making. The candle is burning low now, and the shadows are soft and long. The story of the blue poppy is a weight that we can now set down. It is a part of the past, a dark chapter that has been closed and locked away. The resonance of the protocol has faded into the background noise of history, leaving us in a state of true, natural silence. This is the peace that comes from knowing the truth and reclaiming your own internal territory. Breathe in the quiet. The air is clean, free of the indigo vapor and the psychic hum of the company's machine. You are here in this moment entirely yourself. The bridge is broken, and the path to your dreams is your own. The night is a vast, open space where you are free to wander without a map and without a ledger. The East India Company believed they could own the world's nights, but they were wrong. The night belongs to the sleeper. The darkness is a mercy, a time for the mind to heal and for the spirit to renew itself. The blue poppy has withered, and its resin has returned to the earth. But your dreams are still blooming, vivid and free. But as the company's alchemists fled the burning ruins of their London labs, they took one thing with them, a single golden ledger that was not part of the official harvest. This was the Soul Ledger, a book that contained the names of those who had resisted the protocol and, in doing so, had discovered a way to travel between dreams. While the company was building bridges, these individuals were building a hidden city in the subconscious, a place where the harvest could never reach. The secret of the silent harvest was just beginning to unfold. Imagine a morning in the year 1842 where the sun rises over the lush delta of Bengal. Yet the air is thick with a silence that feels like a physical weight. In 1,000 villages across the continent, people are waking up, but they are not refreshed. They open their eyes to a state of utter mental vacuum. They remember the evening before, the setting sun, and the meal they shared, but the hours of the night are a bleached, empty canvas. There were no dreams of ancestors, no visions of the future, and no processing of the day's grief. This was the silent harvest, the most profound betrayal in the history of the British Empire. It was a forbidden operation, a calculated psychological extraction where the East India Company used atmospheric alchemy to strip the human subconscious of its vitality. This was a secret buried under mountains of corporate paperwork, a lie told to the world that the local populations were simply falling into a state of natural apathy. In reality, it was a curse, a corporate theft of the only sanctuary the poor had left. The company had learned how to tax the mind itself, leaving millions in a state of permanent, waking twilight. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, The chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe slowly and feel the heavy, humid air of the colonial past settling around you. We are stepping away from the waking world and into the archives of the dreamless. The candle flickers, and the story begins to unfold in the rhythmic stillness of the night. To understand the silent harvest, we must look at the bureaucratic machinery of the East India Company through a different lens. History books describe their ledgers as records of silk, tea, and indigo. But the private archives tell a story of a different commodity. In the mid-19th century, a new type of form began to appear in the desks of colonial administrators. These forms were marked with the header, "Unconscious Output." The administrators were not looking at physical labor, but at the mental state of the villages under their control. They were tracking a phenomenon they called the Great Stillness. For the American or European observer of the time, it appeared as though the people of India had simply lost their spark. They were productive in the fields, yes, but they were hollow. They did not sing while they worked. They did not tell stories in the evening. They moved with a mechanical precision that was efficient but devoid of life. The informative depth of this era reveals that this was not a natural occurrence. The company had deployed a series of resonance rods across the countryside. These were copper-sheathed pillars, hidden within the walls of new granaries and warehouses. To the untrained eye, they looked like simple lightning rods or structural supports. In reality, they were tuned to the frequency of the blue poppy extract we have discussed. During the night, as the villagers slept, these rods acted as siphons. They captured the bioelectrical energy produced during the REM cycle. The subconscious mind, when it dreams, generates a specific type of cognitive heat. The company had figured out how to harvest this heat and store it in silver-lined canisters. They were literally mining the dreams of an entire continent. Imagine the sensation of waking up after such a harvest. You feel the physical rest in your muscles, but your mind feels like a house that has been burgled while you were away. There is a sense of violation that you cannot name. You look at your children and you see the same vacant stare in their eyes. You try to remember the face of your grandfather, but the image is blurry. As if the color has been drained from the memory, the company's medical officers, men who were paid to keep the secret, recorded these symptoms with cold, clinical detachment. They called it the hollow eye syndrome. In their reports to London, they claimed it was a side effect of the climate or a lack of moral character in the subjects. But in their private journals, they wrote about the terrifying efficiency of the harvest. One officer wrote that a single night in a village near Dhaka could produce enough refined dream essence to keep a London aristocrat in a state of heightened creativity for a month. The moral decay of this system was total. The company was not just stealing resources from the earth. They were stealing the internal architecture of the human soul. They understood that a man who dreams is a man who can imagine a different life. A woman who sees visions in her sleep is a woman who cannot be fully owned. By harvesting the dreams, the company was ensuring that the population remained in a state of permanent, predictable compliance. The information gathered from these harvests was sent back to the Department of Intangible Assets. There, the dreams were decoded. The company was looking for more than just energy. They were looking for secrets. They believed that the collective subconscious of the East held ancient knowledge of alchemy, medicine, and mathematics. They were literally stripping the minds of their subjects to fuel the scientific and industrial progress of the West. As we move deeper into the archive of the silent harvest, the candle beside us burns steady and low. The records of 1842 show that the scale of the operation began to expand beyond the rural villages and into the bustling cities of Calcutta and Bombay. The company realized that the more complex the mind, the richer the harvest. The dreams of scholars, poets, and merchants were far more valuable than the simple rest of the laborers in the city centers. The resonance rods were hidden within the spires of new colonial buildings and the clock towers that were beginning to define the urban skyline. The bells of these towers were not just for telling time. They were struck with a specific subsonic frequency that prepared the minds of the people for the nightly extraction. It was a rhythmic, invisible command to surrender the subconscious. The psychological impact on the urban population was devastating. Entire neighborhoods would wake up and find they had lost the ability to perform complex creative tasks. Musicians forgot the melodies they had been composing. Architects stared at their blueprints and saw only meaningless lines. The cultural heart of the continent was being systematically emptied, one night at a time. The informative depth of the company's research into this area is truly haunting. They categorized dreams like they categorized spices. There were graded dreams, which were full of inventive thoughts and mathematical insights. There were grade B dreams, which contained emotional resilience and communal bonds. And then there were the husks, the residual fragments of fear and anxiety that the company left behind because they had no commercial value. The people of the colonies began to notice the pattern. Even if they didn't understand the mechanism, they began to call the company officials the soul eaters. In the markets, there were whispers of how the English never seemed to sleep, yet always looked refreshed. There were rumors of the silver canisters being loaded onto ships at midnight, glowing with a faint violet light. The moral decay of the British officials stationed in the colonies was accelerated by their proximity to the harvest. They were given small doses of the refined essence to keep them alert and productive, but the essence was addictive. It gave them a sense of godlike clarity and power. They began to view the people they ruled not as human beings, but as reservoirs of a precious fluid. They became cold, detached, and increasingly cruel. One administrator, a man named Henderson, wrote about the experience of using the essence. He described it as having 1,000 suns burning in his brain. He said he could see the connections between all things, the movement of the tides and the flow of the markets. But he also admitted that he could no longer feel empathy. When he looked at the starving peasants in the streets, he saw only wasted potential for the harvest. The silent harvest was also a way for the company to prevent rebellion. In the years leading up to the Great Mutiny, the company increased the intensity of the extraction in areas known for their descent. They found that by stripping the people of their dreams, they could strip them of their will to fight. A man who cannot dream of freedom is a man who will accept his chains. The harvest was a form of chemical and psychological warfare, conducted in the silence of the night. Think about the atmosphere of such a world. A whole continent, vibrant and full of history, suddenly falling quiet. The festivals were still held, but the joy was gone. The stories were still told, but they were hollow repetitions of the past. The people were moving through a world they no longer fully understood, because the mental bridge between their past and their future had been severed. The informative reality of the silent harvest is that it left a permanent scar on the collective memory of the region. Even after the company was disbanded and the rods were removed, the people struggled to regain their dreaming capacity. It was as if the soil of the mind had been over-farmed and needed decades to recover. This is a part of colonial history that is never mentioned in the textbooks. Yet, it explains so much of the psychological trauma that followed. The silver canisters were eventually shipped to London, where the essence was released in the private clubs of the aristocracy. The Victorian era's sudden burst of literature, science, and exploration was fueled in part by this stolen mental energy. The elite of London were living off the dreams of India, building an empire on the foundation of 1 billion stolen nights. As the night air grows cooler, we reach the final chapters of the Silent Harvest. By the late 1840s, the company's greed had reached a point of no return. They were harvesting so much energy that the canisters were beginning to leak. The refined dream essence was spilling back into the world, but in a distorted, chaotic form. This led to the phenomenon of the London fog, which we now know was more than just coal smoke and moisture. It was the concentrated, unprocessed grief of a colonized continent. The informative documents from the company's alchemists show that they were terrified of this leakage. They realized that the stolen dreams were not just energy, they were identities. When the essence leaked, it brought with it the memories and emotions of the people it had been taken from. This created a state of collective haunting in the streets of London. People began to have visions of landscapes they had never seen and spoken tongues they had never learned. The moral decay of the company's leadership was now complete. Instead of stopping the harvest, they attempted to weaponize the leakage. They tried to create a version of the essence that could be used to induce specific nightmares in their political enemies. They were no longer just trading in spices or sleep. They were trading in terror. They had become the architects of a global psychological prison, but the silent harvest could not be sustained forever. The human mind has a way of resisting even the most sophisticated extractions. In the villages of Bengal, the people began to develop a ritual of their own. They learned how to dream in the waking world, a technique of collective visualization that bypassed the resonance rods. They found that, if they shared their stories while they were awake, the company could not take them. This was the beginning of the secret resistance. The people began to weave their dreams into their songs, their textiles, and their art. They created a physical archive of their subconscious that the company's alchemists could not touch. This was the true strength of the continent, a resilience that the colonial power had not accounted for. The silent harvest had taken their nights, but it could not take their ability to remember who they were. The end of the silent harvest came with the collapse of the East India Company after 1857, the new colonial administration, under the direct rule of the Crown, realized that the harvest was too dangerous to continue. The risk of a total psychological collapse of the empire was too high. They ordered the destruction of the resonance rods and the burial of the remaining canisters in the deep vaults beneath London. However, the informative reality is that the essence was never fully destroyed. Some of it remained in the bloodlines of the aristocracy, passed down through generations. Some of it remained in the architecture of the cities, where the old clock towers still vibrate with a faint, ghostly frequency. And some of it remains in the very air we breathe, a lingering residue of a time when the world was divided into the harvesters and the harvested. As you listen to the steady rhythm of your own breath, recognize the value of your dreams. They are not just random images of the night. They are your mental autonomy. They are the way you process your life and imagine your future. The story of the silent harvest is a reminder that there are forces in the world that will always try to take what is most precious and intangible. The silence of the villages of 1842 is a long way from the world we live in today, but the lessons remain. We must guard our rest and protect our subconscious. We must refuse to be hollowed out by the demands of a world that views us as resources. Your mind is a sanctuary, a place of infinite depth and color that no ledger can ever fully account for. The candle is now a small pool of wax, its flame a tiny, bright point in the darkness. The archives of the silent harvest are closing, the heavy leather covers settling into place. The history of the dream thieves is a dark one, but it is a history that has been brought into the light. You are no longer part of the harvest. You are the master of your own nights. Feel the weight of your body against the bed, the softness of the blankets, and the security of the room. The world outside is quiet, and the only sound is the gentle pulse of the present moment. You are safe. You are whole. Your dreams are coming, and they are entirely your own. They are a gift that cannot be taxed, a territory that cannot be occupied, and a light that cannot be dimmed. The history of the East India Company is a history of gold and blood, but it is also a history of the invisible and the eternal. By acknowledging the silent harvest, we give back the voices to those who were silenced. We recognize the profound loss of those dreamless years and the incredible strength of those who survived them. The story ends here, but the peace you have found in the telling will stay with you. But even as the company's rods were being torn down, the directors were already planning their next move. They had discovered that while dreams could be harvested, there was one thing even more powerful, the collective will of a grieving heart. They began to experiment with a new type of currency, one that wasn't based on sleep, but on the very essence of human memory itself. They called it the soul ledger, and its entries were written in the blood of the forgotten. The secret of the governor's insomnia was about to reveal a new level of darkness behind the heavy, iron-reinforced mahogany doors of Leadenhall Street, in a room that smelled of sulfur, expensive sandalwood, and ancient copper, sat a man who history has tried to forget. Lord Alistair Thorne was officially the chairman of the East India Company during its most aggressive expansion, but the private, vellum-wrapped journals of the board suggest a far more terrifying reality. Thorne was not a businessman. He was a master of the forbidden arts, a Negro alchemist who viewed the British Empire not as a political entity, but as a vast ritualistic machine. He was the architect of the Soul Ledger and the true mind behind the Blue Poppy Protocol. While the public saw a man concerned with tea prices and textile exports, Thorne was busy directing the company's metaphysical acquisitions. He believed that gold was a crude currency and that the only true wealth was the refined essence of human memory and spirit. This was a profound betrayal of every person who served under the company flag. Lord Thorne used the corporate structure to hide a grand curse, a lie so deep that it reached the ears of the king himself. He did not seek to rule the world. He sought to own the very fabric of the afterlife. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe in the stillness of this moment. Let the weight of the day fall away as we descend into the private office of Lord Alistair Thorne. The year is 1842, and the shadows in London are longer and darker than they have ever been. To step into the CEO's office was to leave the Victorian world behind. The walls were lined not with maps of geography, but with maps of human consciousness. These were intricate, hand-drawn charts of the dreaming mind, marked with the exact coordinates of the resonance rods we have explored. Lord Thorn spent his nights here, illuminated by a single, blue-flamed candle that never seemed to shorten. He was a man of cold, surgical precision, his eyes reflecting the metallic sheen of the silver canisters that sat on his desk. Thorn's rise to power was as mysterious as his methods. He appeared in London with no clear lineage, but possessed a wealth of ancient knowledge that captivated the company's directors. He spoke of the metaphysical potential of the East, promising a level of control that went beyond simple taxation. He convinced the board that the true secret to immortality lay in the collective subconscious of the colonies. Under his leadership, the East India Company began to acquire more than just land. They began to purchase sacred artifacts, burial grounds, and ancestral spirits. The informative depth of Thorn's acquisitions reveals a calculated strategy. He was not interested in the religious value of these items. He viewed them as batteries, repositories of concentrated human emotion. By bringing these artifacts back to London, he was effectively building a psychic fortress. The CEO's office was the central hub for this energy. Every time a resonance rod in Bengal captured a dream, a small, silver bell on Thorn's desk would chime with a frequency that only he could hear. The moral decay of the boardroom began with the introduction of the Cabinet of 13. This was a secret council of the company's most powerful shareholders, led by Thorn. They did not discuss trade routes or military campaigns. Instead, they participated in rituals designed to bond their own spirits to the company's longevity. They believed that as long as the company existed, they would never truly die. They were becoming corporate ghosts, entities whose existence was tied to a ledger and a seal. Think about the atmosphere of these meetings. 13 men in high-collared coats sitting in a circle of candlelight, their breaths synchronized by the low hum of the indigo vapor. They were the harvesters of the world, and Lord Thorn was their high priest. He taught them how to consume the refined dream essence, how to use it to clear their minds of guilt and doubt. They were no longer men of flesh and blood. They were vessels for a stolen vitality. Thorn's philosophy was one of absolute utility. He famously wrote in a private memorandum that a human being is merely a temporary housing for a permanent resource. This resource, the subconscious, was being wasted in the natural cycle of life and death. The company's mission, in his eyes, was to interrupt that cycle and divert the resource for the benefit of the British elite. This was the ideological foundation of the soul ledger, a concept that Thorn refined into a science of spiritual extraction. As you listen to the rhythmic pulse of the clock in this quiet room, imagine Lord Thorn's hand as he signs a new decree. The ink he used was infused with the very extract we have studied, making every order he gave a physical extension of his will. When a governor in a distant province read an order from Thorn, they felt a compulsion that was not entirely their own. It was a corporate spell cast from the heart of London, designed to ensure that the harvest never faltered. As the night air grows cooler, we delve deeper into the alchemical secrets of Lord Alistair Thorn. His office was not just a place of business. It was a laboratory of the human soul. Behind a hidden panel in the oak-lined walls lay a collection of what he called metaphysical assets. These were not statues or coins, but fragments of glass and copper that had been exposed to the most intense moments of human history. Thorn believed that objects could hold the residue of a soul's transition, and he used these fragments to tune his instruments to the frequency of the afterlife. The informative reality of Thorn's work is staggering. He had managed to synthesize a version of the blue poppy extract that was much more potent than the one used in the colonies. This was the golden essence, a substance reserved only for the CEO himself. While the directors were satisfied with the stolen dreams of the poor, Thorne was chasing something higher. He wanted the dreams of the prophets, the visions of the saints, and the creative spark of the world's greatest thinkers. He was a predator of the intellect, a thief of the divine. The moral decay of this pursuit was evident in Thorne's physical appearance. Witnesses from the time noted that he did not seem to age, yet he lacked the warmth of a living being. His skin was like polished marble, and his voice had a resonant, metallic quality that made listeners feel a sudden, unexplainable chill. He was becoming a living artifact, a man who had replaced his own internal life with the harvested energy of others. He was the personification of the company's ultimate goal, a machine that looked like a man, powered by the ghosts of an empire. Thorne's influence extended into the very architecture of London. He was instrumental in the design of the new tunnels and vaults being constructed beneath the city. Officially, these were for sewage and transport, but Thorne had them laid out in specific patterns that mirrored the ley lines of the earth. He was turning London into a giant circuit, a machine that could broadcast the resonant frequencies of the soul ledger to every corner of the capital. This was the true meaning of the London Fog, a medium for the transmission of the CEO's will. The psychological layer of Thorne's rule was one of total surveillance. He believed that the company should not only own a man's labor, but his very thoughts. He commissioned the construction of the Whispering Gallery at St. Paul's Cathedral, not for its acoustic beauty, but as a testing ground for long-distance psychic transmission. He wanted to be able to whisper an order in Leadenhall Street and have it heard in the subconscious of a clerk in Greenwich. He was building a world where privacy was a forgotten concept. Consider the informative depth of the company's metaphysical acquisitions department. This was a team of specialized researchers who traveled to the most remote corners of the world, not to find spices, but to find individuals with unique mental capabilities. When such a person was found, they were not recruited. They were acquired. Their life stories were erased from the public record, and they were brought to London to serve as biological processors for Thorne's experiments. They were the human components of his grand machine. Thorne's boardroom was a place of absolute silence. No one spoke unless they were addressed by the CEO. The only sound was the scratching of pens on vellum and the low, constant hum of the silver canisters. The directors were terrified of him, not because of his political power, but because they knew he could see into their minds. He knew their secrets, their fears, and their hidden ambitions. He held them in a state of perpetual psychological debt, ensuring that they would never challenge his authority. 1. Of the most disturbing entries in Thorne's journal describes a project called the Porcelain Court. He was obsessed with the idea of creating a permanent, indestructible version of the human form that could house a captured subconscious. He worked with the finest porcelain makers in Europe and the most skilled clockmakers in London to create a series of lifelike dolls. These were not toys. They were vessels. Thorne believed that the ultimate evolution of the company was to replace its human employees with these porcelain entities, creating a workforce that never slept, never aged, and never rebelled. This vision of a hollowed-out humanity was the end goal of the alchemist of the boardroom. He saw the world as a collection of parts to be assembled according to his design. He had no regard for the beauty of the natural world or the complexity of human emotion. To him, these were just variables in an equation of power. He was the first true corporate monster, a man who had sacrificed his own soul to become the master of everyone else's dot as the night reaches its deepest point. The story of Lord Alistair Thorne takes its final, most chilling turn. By the year 1845, the CEO had become so disconnected from humanity that he rarely left his office. He had created a system that was self-sustaining, a network of extractions and resonances that required only his periodic oversight. But the feedback from the Blue Poppy Protocol, the collective grief we have mentioned, was starting to penetrate even his formidable defenses. The alchemist was beginning to be haunted by the very essence he had worked so hard to harvest. The informative records from the company's final years describe Thorne's office as being filled with a constant, ghostly light. The silver canisters were vibrating so intensely that they had to be bolted to the floor. Thorne himself was seen talking to empty chairs, addressing the spirits of the people whose dreams he had stolen. The moral decay had finally reached the source. The predator was becoming the prey, consumed by the overwhelming weight of 1,000,000 harvested lives. Thorne's response to this haunting was not one of regret, but one of escalation. He decided to perform a final ritual, the Great Consolidation. He wanted to merge all the captured energy in the soul ledger into a single, massive consciousness that he would control. He believed that this would give him the power to rewrite history itself, to erase his crimes and become the permanent architect of the human future. He prepared his office for a surge of energy that London had never seen. The psychological atmosphere of the building on that final night was one of pure terror. The clerks and guards reported a feeling of being watched by 1,000 eyes. The air was so thick with indigo vapor that it was almost impossible to breathe. At the stroke of midnight, Thorne activated the central resonant chamber. The result was not the consolidation he had hoped for, but a total catastrophic release. The silver canisters shattered, and the harvested essence poured out in a tidal wave of raw emotion and memory. The informative depth of this event is shrouded in secrecy, but the aftermath was clear. Lord Alistair Thorne disappeared that night. His office was found empty, the walls scorched by a blue fire that left no smoke. The vellum maps were turned to ash, and the cabinet of 13 was found in a state of catatonic shock. They could no longer remember who they were or what they had done. The alchemist had been erased by the very power he sought to master, but the East India Company did not die that night. The corporate structure was too vast, too deeply embedded in the world to simply vanish. The new directors, horrified by what they found, attempted to bury the truth. They rebranded the company, shifted its focus back to traditional trade, and destroyed every piece of evidence of Thorne's occult experiments. They turned the CEO's office into a storage room and declared Lord Thorne a casualty of a sudden, tragic illness, yet the legacy of the alchemist remains. The tunnels he built still run beneath London, channeling the residual energy of the soul ledger. The porcelain dolls he designed were sold off to private collectors, where they are said to whisper in the night to those who listen closely. And the golden essence, the refined extract of 1,000 prophets, is rumored to be held in a secret vault at the Bank of England. Waiting for a new master to discover its power, Thorne proved that a corporation could be more than just a business. It could be a predatory organism with a life of its own. He showed that the human spirit is a resource that can be mapped, harvested, and traded. While he was defeated by the sheer volume of the souls he stole, the methods he pioneered are still in use today. Every time we sacrifice our privacy for convenience, every time we let a corporate entity into our subconscious, We are walking in the shadow of Lord Alistair Thorne. As you drift closer to sleep, consider the silence of the boardroom. It is the silence of a void, a place where humanity was traded for profit. But it is also a place of warning. We must be the guardians of our own internal worlds. We must refuse to be categorized as assets on a corporate ledger. Our dreams, our memories, and our spirits are the only things that truly belong to us, and we must defend them with everything we are. The fire in Thorne's office has long since gone out, and the blue flame is nothing but a memory. The air in London is clear, and the shadows are just shadows once again. You are safe in the quiet of the present, far away from the reach of the alchemist. The night is a time of restoration, a time to reclaim what was lost and to build a fortress of peace around your own heart. Breathe in the natural stillness. There is no indigo in the air, no resonance in the walls, and no CEO watching from the dark. You are the master of your own thoughts, the weaver of your own dreams. The story of the alchemist of the boardroom is a cautionary tale, a dark piece of history that helps us appreciate the light of our own individuality. The night is long and deep, a vast ocean where you can swim without fear. Let the weight of the past fall away, and let the silence of the room be your comfort. You have heard the secret, and in knowing it, you have neutralized its power. The alchemist is gone, and the world belongs to the living once more. But as the company's records were being burned, one small nondescript ledger was saved by a low-level clerk who realized its true value. This was not a book of names or numbers, but a blueprint for a place that shouldn't exist. It described a massive underground facility known as the Architecture of the Void, located directly beneath the heart of London. It was here that the company stored the things that were too dangerous to keep above ground, the things that had no shape, no weight, and no mercy. The secret of the vaults was about to be uncovered. Underneath the bustling commerce of Leadenhall Street, beneath the heavy boots of merchants and the iron wheels of carriages, lies a structural betrayal that no map of London dares to show. While the city above ground built cathedrals to God and palaces to kings, the East India Company built a cathedral to the vacuum. This is the architecture of the void, a subterranean labyrinth of reinforced lead and cold. Neoclassical masonry where the stolen subconscious of an entire empire was catalogued and caged. It was a forbidden construction, a secret buried 60 feet below the water table, designed to resonate with the frequencies of human rest. Within these lightless halls, thousands of pressurized silver jars were stacked in endless rows, each one containing the extracted dreams, the forbidden hopes, and the spiritual vitality of people from distant lands. This was a grand lie, a corporate curse disguised as an engineering marvel. The company did not just store wealth here. They stored the very essence of human identity, keeping it in a state of suspended animation to fuel their own dark longevity. The air in these vaults is not meant for the living, for it carries the static charge of 1,000,000 interrupted nights. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe deeply as the sounds of the modern street fade into a rhythmic, distant echo. We are descending a staircase of damp stone, lit only by the soft blue flicker of an alchemical lantern. The air grows cooler, the world grows still, and the weight of the earth above us becomes a comforting heavy blanket. To enter the vaults beneath Leadenhall Street was to enter a space where the laws of the physical world felt thin and brittle. The entrance was hidden behind a false wall in the East India House basement, a door made of solid oak reinforced with copper plates to prevent the leakage of the psychic energy stored within. As you descend, the walls transition from common brick to a strange, smooth stone that feels unnaturally cold to the touch. This stone was imported from the high mountains of the east, chosen for its ability to insulate the void from the vibrations of the waking city above. The stairs are narrow and steep, winding down in a perfect spiral that mimics the structure of a nautilus shell. With every step, the pressure in your ears changes, a subtle reminder that you are moving into a territory that was never meant for human lungs. The only sound is the rhythmic drip of water and the low, constant hum of the silver vats. It is a sound that vibrates in your chest more than your ears, a frequency of deep, artificial slumber. At the bottom of the stairs, the corridor opens into the great gallery of the void. It is an immense chamber, the ceiling supported by pillars carved in the shape of weeping willows, their stone branches draped in chains of oxidized silver. The floor is polished obsidian, reflecting the dim light like a dark, frozen lake. Here, the atmosphere is heavy with the scent of ozone and dry lavender, a combination used by the company's alchemists to stabilize the volatile essence of the dreams. As you walk down the central aisle, you are flanked by the silver forest. These are the storage racks, reaching from the floor to the high, arched ceiling. On every shelf sit the jars. They are crafted from a special alloy of silver and mercury, their surfaces etched with the names of the provinces from which the contents were harvested: Bengal, Bihar, Madras, Bombay. The labels are written in a clinical copperplate script, detailing the date of extraction and the grade of the subconscious energy within. The informative depth of this storage system is a testament to the company's obsession with order. They did not just throw the dreams together. They categorized them by intensity and type. Some jars contain the quietude of rural farmers used to stabilize the moods of the British Parliament. Others contain the fervor of young revolutionaries, kept under high pressure to prevent the energy from igniting. There are even jars marked ancestral echoes, which were believed to contain the collective memories of entire lineages. The psychological impact of being in this room is profound. Even though the jars are sealed, the sheer volume of human experience stored here creates a field of thick time. Every breath you take feels like it has been drawn from a different century. You might feel a sudden, unexplainable wave of grief or a flicker of a joy that does not belong to you. This is the leakage, the subtle radiation of a million souls held in a corporate cage. The company officials who worked here had to wear lead-lined aprons and silk masks to protect their own minds from being subsumed by the forest of silver. Why did they build it so deep? The answer lies in the nature of the void itself. The company's researchers discovered that the deeper you go into the earth, the more the human subconscious is willing to detach from the body. By placing the vaults at this specific depth, they ensured that the stolen dreams would not try to return to their owners during the night. The earth acted as a grounding wire, a massive anchor for the ethereal wealth of the empire. As we move deeper into the silver forest, the scale of the vaults becomes almost impossible to comprehend. The Great Gallery is only the first of 12 identical chambers, laid out in the shape of a clock face beneath the heart of London. Each chamber corresponds to a different hour of the night, a structural map of the human sleep cycle. The company had mapped the varied geography of rest and turned it into a basement floor plan. This was the pinnacle of their moral decay, the belief that even the ticking of the cosmic clock was a commodity to be owned and Organized dot in the center of this clock-like arrangement sits the reservoir. This is a massive circular vat made of reinforced glass and gold filigree. It is filled with a swirling, pearlescent liquid that moves as if it has its own will. This is the primary essence, the result of mixing thousands of different dreams into a single, unified consciousness. The company's alchemists called it the spirit of the board. It was intended to be the ultimate source of corporate wisdom, a liquid mind that directors could consult before making any major decision. The informative reality of the reservoir is chilling. To maintain the stability of the liquid mind, the company had to feed it a constant stream of fresh subconscious energy. This required the nightly operations we have heard about, the resonance rods in the colonies, the Indigo Fog in London, and the Blue Poppy Protocol. The architecture of the void was not just a storage facility. It was a metabolic system. It was the stomach of the company, digesting the dreams of the world to produce the fuel for its own unnatural life. As you stand before the reservoir, you can see faint images flickering within the pearlescent depths. You see the faces of children in the paddy fields, the hands of weavers in the mills, and the eyes of scholars in the ancient libraries. These are not just memories. They are the living components of the company's power. The images are brief, appearing for a second before being pulled back into the swirling mass of the liquid. It is a hypnotic sight, one that makes the observer feel a strange, pulling sensation behind their own eyes, as if their own dreams are trying to join the reservoir. The architects who designed this space were men of high learning and low morals. They utilized the principles of sacred geometry and acoustic resonance to create a chamber that literally sang to the sleeping city above. The pillars were tuned to a specific frequency that encouraged the descent of the subconscious. This is why the area around Leadenhall Street was known for having the highest rate of deep, dreamless sleep in all of London. The building itself was a predator, a stone and silver beast that breathed in the nights of its neighbors and exhaled a cold, corporate silence. The psychological layer of the vaults is most evident in the Chamber of the Forgotten. This is a smaller room, located at the very center of the clock, where the jars that have lost their charge are kept. When a dream is harvested, it has a shelf life. Over time, the emotional intensity fades and the jar becomes a husk. These husks were not discarded. Instead, they were kept in this dark, silent room. The company believed that even a hollow dream had value, acting as a filler for the subconscious of those who had become too aware of the theft. Think about the silence of this chamber. It is not a peaceful silence. It is an empty one. It is the silence of a house where no one lives, of a book where the pages have been bleached white. The air here is thin and tastes of copper. To spend more than a few minutes in the Chamber of the Forgotten is to feel your own sense of self beginning to unravel. The company used this room as a punishment for employees who showed signs of empathy or hesitation. They would be locked in with the husks until they, too, felt like hollow shells, ready to be refilled with corporate doctrine. The informative archives of the company mention a specific ritual known as the Inventory of the Invisible. Once a year, the board of directors would descend into the vaults. They would walk the silver forest, their silk robes whispering against the obsidian floor. They would touch the jars, feeling the vibrations of the stolen lives within. This was their true annual report. They didn't care about the gold in the Bank of England, as much as they cared about the mental surplus stored beneath their feet. They understood that as long as they owned the dreams of the world, They own the future. As we reach the furthest reaches of the architecture of the void, we find the scribe's office. This is where the soul ledger was actually maintained. It is a small, claustrophobic room carved directly into the bedrock. The walls are lined with thousands of small wooden drawers, each containing a single card that corresponds to a jar in the forest. The scribes were men who had been processed by the company until they had no internal life of their own. They were biological extensions of the ledger, their hands moving in a blur of ink and vellum as they recorded the intake and outflow of human spirits. The informative details in this room are the most terrifying of all. On the wall hangs a map of the world, but the continents are replaced by a network of glowing lines. These are the veins of the empire, the trade routes that the company used to transport the silver jars. The map shows that the vaults beneath Leadenhall Street were the heart of a global system. There were similar smaller vaults in Calcutta, Hong Kong, and Cape Town, all of them connected by the ghost ships we have discussed. The architecture of the void was a planetary-scale machine. The moral decay of the scribes was total. They no longer saw people as individuals, but as units of cognitive resonance. They would record the death of 1,000 people in a colonial famine, not with sorrow, but with a calculation of how much grief essence could be harvested from the survivors. To them, the world was a ledger, and the human soul was a series of numbers to be balanced. They were the ultimate accountants of the invisible, men who had traded their own humanity for a perfect record of everyone else's. In the final chamber of the vaults, known as the aperture, the company kept their most dangerous asset. This was a single, massive jar made of pure crystal, encased in a cage of gold and iron. Inside this jar was the dream of the king. The company had found a way to harvest the subconscious of the reigning monarch, believing that by owning the king's dreams, they could steer the destiny of the entire nation. This was the ultimate betrayal. The secret that was so profound that even the board of directors only spoke of it in coded symbols. The aperture was designed to broadcast the king's harvested will into the other jars in the forest. By doing this, the company could flavor the dreams of the world with royal authority. They were literally engineering a global subconscious that was loyal to the crown, and by extension, loyal to the company. It was a loop of psychological control that was intended to be unbreakable. The king believed he was ruling by divine right, unaware that his own subconscious was being used as a corporate broadcasting station. The psychological atmosphere of the aperture is one of overwhelming majesty and dread. The air vibrates with a frequency that feels like a heavy golden hand pressing down on your shoulders. It is a room that demands obedience. The walls are etched with the genealogies of the royal bloodlines, and the floor is covered in a carpet made of the finest silk, woven with the memories of 1,000 weavers. Here, the moral decay of the empire is laid bare. They had turned the highest office of the land into a tool for the lowest form of theft. As the candle in our lantern begins to flicker and die, we must begin our ascent back to the world above. The walk back through the silver forest is a long and quiet one. You pass the rows of jars, their soft blue glow fading as you move away. You pass the reservoir, where the images of the stolen lives continue to swirl in their pearlescent prison. You pass the scribe's office, where the pens continue to scratch against the vellum in the dark. The informative reality of the vaults is that they are still there. Though the East India House was demolished and the company dissolved, the subterranean chambers were never fully emptied. The lead-lined walls and the eastern stone were built to last for centuries. History tells us that the assets were transferred to the crown, but the crown has never acknowledged their existence. The architecture of the void remains a silent, hidden reality beneath the financial heart of modern London. As you reach the top of the spiral staircase and step back into the basement of the East India House, the air feels thin and artificial. The noise of the city above is a jarring, chaotic mess after the deep, engineered silence of the vaults. You carry the secret with you now, a weight in your mind that makes the world look different. The buildings are no longer just stone and glass. They are the lids on 1,000,000 silver jars. The people are no longer just workers and shoppers. They are the potential yield of a harvest that never truly ended. Breathe in the cool night air. You are safe in the present, away from the cold obsidian floors and the whispering willow pillars. The story of the vaults is a map of a darkness that we are only beginning to understand. By walking through these chambers in your mind, you have reclaimed a piece of the history that was stolen from you. You have looked into the void and seen the silver forest, and in doing so, you have protected your own nights from the collectors. The night is your own, a vast and private wilderness where no corporate architect can build a staircase. Let the weight of the day settle into the earth beneath you, and let your own dreams rise up, vivid and uncatalogued. You are the master of your own internal architecture, and your soul is a temple that can never be measured by a ledger. But as the final vellum page of the 1842 inventory was signed, a new and even more disturbing trend began to emerge in the records. The silver jars were not just being filled, they were being traded. A secret auction was being held in the heart of London, where the most powerful men in the world bid on the stolen dreams of the poor as if they were fine wines. They were not just storing the invisible, they were selling it. The secret of the London auction was about to reveal how far the decay had truly spread. Imagine a room in the heart of London, where the most powerful men in the world gathered not to trade stocks or gold, but to bid on the very essence of human life. This was the London auction, a forbidden marketplace of the invisible where the stolen dreams of the poor were sold like fine vintages of wine. For the elite of the 1840s, it was not enough to own the land and the labor of the masses. They sought to own their vitality. They believed that by consuming the refined subconscious energy stored in silver jars, they could bypass the natural decay of the human mind and live in a state of perpetual, cold clarity. This was a grand betrayal of the human condition, a secret market where a child's dream was auctioned to the highest, bitter to soothe the conscience of a merchant or prolong the mental acuity of a banker. It was a trade in stolen souls, a curse that turned the British aristocracy into psychological vampires feeding on the rest of the world. This was the ultimate moral decay, a hidden exchange that fueled the progress of an empire at the cost of its humanity. The elite did not just buy rest. They bought the intellectual heritage of entire cultures, mining the spirit to fuel their cold ambition. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe in the stillness of this moment. Let the weight of the day fall away as we descend into the hidden depths of a Victorian gentleman's club. The year is 1842, and the flickering candles cast long, rhythmic shadows on the velvet walls. We are stepping into a circle of silence where the only sound is the soft clink of silver and the rustle of vellum. The location was a nondescript building near the Royal Exchange, unmarked and guarded by men who had been processed to see nothing and remember less. Inside, the atmosphere was thick with the scent of beeswax and the metallic tang of the silver canisters. The room was circular, a theater of shadows where the elite sat in high-backed leather chairs, their faces obscured by the dim lighting. They were the masters of the world, but here they were something else. They were addicts of the intangible. The air felt heavy, almost liquid, as if the very space were saturated with the residual thoughts of those who had gone before. You could feel a faint pressure against your skin, a static charge that made the fine hairs on your arms stand up. The auctioneer was a man of clinical precision, his voice a low, resonant drone that seemed to vibrate in the very marrow of your bones. He did not use a wooden gavel. He used a small hammer made of fossilized ivory, its strike on the silver plate marking the end of a human hope or a stolen memory. The catalogs were printed on paper that shimmered with a faint violet hue, listing the lots not by weight or volume, but by the intensity of the emotional resonance. There was no shouting here, no frantic bidding, only the quiet lifting of a gloved hand or the subtle nod of a head. It was a cold, business-like transaction of the sacred, performed with the same detachment one might use to buy a shipment of cotton or a crate of tea. Lot 42, for instance, was described as the vision of a Bengali weaver. Age 7, greater clarity. To the men in that room, this was more than a description. It was a promise of rejuvenation. By inhaling the vaporized essence of that child's dream, a tired politician could regain the mental focus of his youth. It was a redistribution of cognitive wealth, a system where the imaginative power of the colonies was siphoned off to sustain the cognitive dominance of the metropole. The informative depth of these auctions is documented in the secret ledgers that were recently recovered from the company archives. These ledgers reveal that the pricing of dreams was based on a complex algorithm of age, health, and ancestral lineage. A dream from a line of scholars was worth 5 times more than a dream from a line of laborers. Think about the atmosphere as the bidding began. The room was silent, save for the low murmurs of the men in the shadows. The silver jars were brought out on velvet cushions, glowing with a soft, internal light that made the air around them seem to ripple. When a jar was opened, the room would fill with a sudden, sharp clarity, a momentary burst of a different life that the bidders would inhale with a quiet, desperate hunger. They were looking for the spark of genius, the warmth of a mother's lullaby, or the raw, unfiltered courage of a warrior. They were mining the human spirit to fuel their own cold, calculated progress. And they did so without a single thought for the empty lives they left behind in the distant corners of the world. The auctions were held twice a month, always under the cover of the Indigo Fog. The fog acted as a barrier, ensuring that the leakage from the open jars did not reach the general public. For the elite, the auction was a necessity of their station. They believed that the burden of ruling an empire was so great that it required an unnatural amount of mental energy. They viewed the stolen dreams of the poor as a legitimate resource, a tax on the subconscious that the subjects owed to their masters. This belief was the cornerstone of their moral decay. It created a class of people who no longer felt the natural cycles of exhaustion and renewal. They lived in a state of artificial brightness, their minds always sharp, their memories always clear, yet their hearts grew colder with every breath of stolen spirit. One of the most frequent bidders was a prominent member of a global banking dynasty, a man whose name was synonymous with stability and wealth. His private journals reveal that he had not had a natural dream of his own in over a decade. He relied entirely on the high-pressure extractions. He believed that by consuming the anxieties and fears of others, he could better anticipate the shifts in the market. He was a man made of other people's shadows, a composite of 1,000 stolen nights. The informative reality of this psychological vampirism is that it was a self-reinforcing cycle. The more the elite consumed, the more they needed. The high from a refined dream essence was short-lived, followed by a period of profound emotional numbness. This numbness required even more intense doses to overcome, creating a desperate, hidden market that ignored all laws of God and man. Consider the psychological state of the lots themselves. Millions of miles away, a mother would wake up feeling a sudden, inexplicable sense of emptiness. She would go about her day with a hollow feeling in her chest, never knowing that her most beautiful memory of her own mother had been sold for £50 to a merchant in London. This was a theft that left no physical marks, no broken locks, and no missing silver. It was a crime against the invisible, a betrayal that reached across oceans and through the very fabric of time. The company's alchemists had become masters of this extraction, perfecting the resonance rods and the blue poppy extract to ensure that the harvest was as efficient as possible. They were the silent engineers of a global psychic inequality. The auction house also served as a laboratory for social control. The company realized that by tracking which types of dreams were in high demand, they could better understand the psychological vulnerabilities of their own class. If the elite were buying dreams of peace, it meant the threat of war was weighing on them. If they were buying dreams of passion, it meant their own lives had become sterile and dull. The auction was a mirror reflecting the rot at the core of the empire. The men in the leather chairs were not just buying life. They were trying to fill a void that their own greed had created. They were searching for a humanity that they had long ago traded for power. The informative depth of the archives also suggests that certain lots were reserved for specific bloodlines. These were the heritage vials, containing the subconscious energy of ancestors who had been harvested decades earlier. The British elite were using these vials to maintain a sense of continuity, to ensure that the thoughts and values of the previous generation remained active in the minds of the current one. It was a literal preservation of the status quo, a way to prevent the natural evolution of thought and culture. They were locking the future into a permanent, recycled past. As you lie here in the stillness, think about the silence of the city outside that auction room. London was sleeping, unaware that its very essence was being auctioned off in a basement on Leadenhall Street. The gaslights hissed in the fog, and the Thames flowed silently toward the sea, while inside the gentleman's club the hammered ivory fell again and again. Sold to the gentleman in the front row. Sold to the Earl of Nothingness. Every strike was a life altered, a memory erased, a dream extinguished. It was a rhythmic, hypnotic destruction of the human spirit, performed in the name of corporate efficiency and national progress. The moral decay was so deep that it had become invisible, a part of the very air the elite breathed. The final lot of the night was always the most anticipated. It was known as the concentrate of the crown. This was not taken from the queen, but was a mixture of the most potent subconscious energy collected from the royal vaults of conquered dynasties. It was said to give the consumer the feeling of having lived 1,000 years in a single night. The price for this lot was not in gold, but in shares of soul. Bidders would trade pieces of their own future memories, their own future capacity for joy, for a single hour of this celestial clarity. It was a market that eventually consumed its own participants, leaving them as brilliant, hollow shells who could speak 20 languages but could no longer. Remember the feeling of a warm sun on their skin. The moral decay reached its peak when the company began to realize that they could manufacture specific types of dreams by subjecting populations to certain stimuli before harvest. They would play specific musical frequencies into the sleeping quarters of factory workers or introduce specific scents into the air of a colonial village to flavor the subconscious output. They were no longer just harvesting. They were farming the human spirit. They were creating a boutique market for refined human misery or manufactured bliss, adjusting the settings of the world to produce the exact chemical profile required by the London auction block. They were the architects of a reality that was entirely synthetic, a world where even the most private internal experience was a manufactured product. As you listened to the rhythmic ticking of the clock in this quiet room, think about the silence of the auction house after the final gavel fell. The men would leave one by one, their eyes unnaturally bright, their steps light and energetic. They would return to their mansions and their offices, ready to make decisions that would shape the world for another century. They were giants built on the backs of stolen knights, their greatness a byproduct of a billion silent thefts. They looked like men, they spoke like men, but they were fueled by a fire that did not belong to them. They were the living embodiments of the company's true mission, the total commodification of the human experience. The informative archive suggests that the London auction only came to an end when the leakage became too great to contain. The refined essence was starting to infect the auctioneers themselves, causing them to collapse during the bidding as they were overwhelmed by the sudden influx of 1,000 different lives. The ghosts of the dreams were trying to return to the world, manifesting as shadows that moved through the auction house when it was empty. The moral decay had created a hole in the reality of the room, a void that threatened to swallow everyone involved. The elite realized that they had pushed the system too far, that they had opened a door that they could not easily close. They ordered the auction house sealed, the ledgers burned, and the remaining jars buried in the architecture of the void, but the legacy of the auction remains in the very structure of our modern world. We still live in a society where the time and mental energy of the many are harvested for the benefit of the few. The methods are different, the technology has evolved, but the fundamental trade in the invisible has never truly stopped. The silver jars may be hidden, but the philosophy of the harvest continues to guide the engines of commerce and control. We are still living in the shadow of that circular room, still breathing the air that was once thick with the stolen dreams of a continent. The betrayal of 1842 is a ghost that still haunts our nights. Breathe in the natural stillness of your own room. You are safe from the bidders and the collectors. Your dreams are not for sale. They are your private sanctuary, a territory that no hammer can ever strike and no silver jar can ever hold. The auction house is a ruin now, its velvet walls rotted away and its fossilized ivory gavels turned to dust. The light in that room has finally gone out, leaving the ghosts to their own devices. You have heard the secret, and in knowing it, you have reclaimed your own value. You are whole, you are free, and you are awake in a world that is finally beginning to remember its own soul. Your vitality is yours to keep, a treasure that cannot be measured by a ledger or bought with shares of soul. The candles have burned down to their bases, and the scent of aged parchment is fading into the cool night air. The silence of the night is now a warm, protective blanket wrapping around you and keeping the world at bay. You are drifting closer to the edge of your own private world, a place where the logic of the ledger does not exist and the only currency is the peace of your own heart. Let your mind be at rest, for the auction is over and the market is closed for the night. There are no more lots to bid on, no more memories to trade. There is only the soft, steady rhythm of your own breath and the limitless space of your own imagination. You are home, but even as the final bidders left the room and the doors were locked, the company's alchemists were recording a new and terrifying phenomenon. In the villages and cities that had been hollowed out by the harvest, the people were not just tired. They were entering a state of total cognitive collapse, a psychological famine that was spreading like a virus through the trade routes. The elite had taken so much that there was nothing left to sustain the reality of the colonies. The secret of the psychological famine was about to bring the entire empire to its knees. And not even the stolen dreams of kings could stop the coming hunger. By the year 1842, the East India Company had achieved the unthinkable. They had successfully turned the human soul into a line item on a balance sheet. But in their hunger to feed the rising numbers of the London Stock Exchange, they triggered a catastrophe that history has spent a century hiding. It was a psychological famine, a global starvation of the spirit where the collective subconscious of entire nations was harvested until there was nothing left but husks. The betrayal was total. While the British elite grew vibrant and sharp on stolen dreams, the colonies fell into a state of forbidden silence. This was not a famine of grain or water, but a famine of rest. People were waking up with their memories bleached white and their capacity for hope erased. The moral decay of the empire had reached its zenith, realizing they were effectively killing the humanity of their subjects to fuel a market of the invisible. This was a curse, a spiritual drought that left millions trapped in a waking nightmare, performing labor without a soul to guide them. The world believed it was just colonial apathy, but it was a calculated theft of the very essence of human life. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe in the cool, still atmosphere of a forgotten library. Feel the weight of the night as it settles around you, soft and protective. We are descending into the heart of the great silence, where the only sound is the rhythmic heartbeat of history itself. To understand the psychological famine, one must first visualize the sheer scale of the emptiness it created. In the villages of Bengal and the workshops of Bombay, the air changed. It was no longer filled with the vibrant chatter of a people processing their lives through story and dream. Instead, a heavy, sterile stillness settled over the land. It was a world where children stopped playing because they could no longer imagine the games. It was a world where elders sat by the fire, staring into the embers with eyes that saw only a flat gray void. The East India Company had optimized the soul ledger to such a degree that the resonance rods were pulling more than just the surplus of the night. They were pulling the marrow of the mind. This was the era of the hollow eye, a clinical term used by company physicians to describe a population that had been biologically and spiritually overfarmed. The informative depth of these medical records is chilling. They noted that the subjects still moved, still ate, and still followed orders, but the light behind their pupils had been extinguished. They were the first generation of industrial ghosts, maintained in a state of perpetual function by the very chemistry that was robbing them of their existence. Think about the atmosphere of a family home during this time. The candles would flicker on the walls just as they do now, but there was no warmth in the shared silence. A husband would look at his wife and feel nothing but a vague, distant recognition. The emotional connective tissue of society was being dissolved in the silver jars of Leadenhall Street. The company had realized that a person with no internal life is the most efficient worker. They don't complain. They don't dream of better days. They simply exist in the present, a permanent state of twilight that served the interests of the shareholders. The moral decay of this realization was documented in the private letters of the board of directors. They spoke of the famine as an acceptable cost of progress. They believed that the masses didn't need a subconscious, that the burden of dreaming was better handled by the intellectual elite of the empire. They were playing God with the human mind, carving out the capacity for love and grief to make room for more productivity. The stock exchange in London vibrated with the energy of these stolen lives. The numbers rising on the backs of 1 billion missing dreams. As you lie here in the safety of the present. Consider the vulnerability of a mind that cannot rest. Sleep is supposed to be the great equalizer, the one place where the servant is equal to the king. But the East India Company had broken that sacred law. They had turned the bedroom into a factory floor and the night into a second shift. The famine was spreading not just through the colonies, but along the very trade routes that brought the stolen essence back to London. The world was becoming a desert of the spirit, a place where the sun rose and set on a population that had forgotten how to feel the light. The informative reality of this era is that the company was reaching a point of diminishing returns. They had harvested so much that the quality of the yield was dropping. The dreams were becoming thin and bitter, filled with the static of a mind that was breaking under the pressure of the void. The alchemists in the basement labs began to report that the essence was turning gray, losing its pearlescent glow. They were literally starving the world of its vitality, and in doing so, they were beginning to starve themselves. As the night deepens and the shadows in this room grow long, we must look at the human cost of the famine within the very heart of the empire. While the poor in the colonies were the first to be hollowed out, the moral decay eventually began to rot the foundations of London itself. The elite, who had become addicted to the refined essence of stolen dreams, found that they could no longer function without it. They had bypassed their own natural sleep for so long that their bodies had forgotten how to produce their own rest. They were the masters of the world, yet they were slaves to a silver jar. The informative archives describe the London of 1842 as a city divided between those who were empty and those who were overfilled. In the slums of the East End, the same hollow eye syndrome began to appear as the company tested their atmospheric containment on the local working class. The streets were filled with people moving in a daze, their faces masks of exhaustion that no amount of sleep could cure. They were breathing the indigo fog, a vapor that acted as a psychological sponge, soaking up their residual thoughts before they could even form. In the parlors of the wealthy, the scene was different but equally horrific. The aristocracy were vibrating with an unnatural intensity. Their eyes were wide and bloodshot, their speech rapid and disconnected. They were experiencing 1,000 lives at once, the fragmented memories of a dozen different cultures clashing in their brains. They had become a collective of fragmented identities, losing the thread of their own lives in the pursuit of a manufactured brilliance. This was the high-water mark of the betrayal, a society that had traded its sanity for a temporary advantage in the markets. Consider the psychological layer of this existence. How does one maintain a sense of self when your every thought is shadowed by the stolen grief of another? The elite were beginning to realize that the soul is not a commodity that can be neatly separated from its owner. The grief of the harvested populations was beginning to manifest in the dreams of the harvesters. They would wake up screaming from nightmares of monsoons they had never seen and ancestors they did not recognize. The famine was creating a feedback loop of trauma that threatened to collapse the entire corporate structure. The company responded with even more forbiddance measures. They began to develop the erase, a process of stripping the stolen essence of all its emotional markers before it was sold. They wanted the pure cognitive power without the baggage of the human experience. They were trying to create a sterile, mathematical spirit, a version of humanity that was as cold and predictable as a ledger. This was the ultimate moral decay, an attempt to build a world where even our internal world was standardized and scrubbed of its messy, beautiful complexity. Think about the silence of the children during this time. In both the colonies and the heart of London, a generation was being raised in a world without wonder. If the parents cannot dream, they cannot teach their children how to imagine. The informative depth of the journals from this period suggests a sudden drop in the use of metaphor and poetry. Language became transactional, focused entirely on the material and the immediate. The human soul was being pruned, its branches cut back until it was nothing but a stump, incapable of reaching for the sky. As you breathe in the quiet of this room, ask yourself, what is the value of a single night of natural sleep? To the East India Company, it was worth exactly the amount of productivity it could generate the next day. But to the human being, it is the foundation of everything we are. The famine was a theft of that foundation. It was an attempt to make us top-heavy, to build a giant empire on a base that was crumbling into dust. The air in 1842 was thick with the scent of this decay, a sweet, cloying smell of over-refined spirits and rotting foundations. The informative reality of the famine is that it created a hole in our historical memory. There are years of colonial life that are simply blank, not because the records were lost, but because the people living them were not fully there. They were existing in a state of cognitive blackout, a programmed amnesia that served the interests of the company. We are only now beginning to uncover the extent of this void, to realize that the history we were taught is only the surface of a much deeper and darker ocean. We reach the final, most haunting stage of the psychological famine. By the late autumn of 1842, the famine had reached a tipping point where the social fabric of the empire was beginning to tear. In the colonies, the people had reached a level of hollowing that made them unable to even follow simple commands. The labor force was literally breaking down, not from physical weakness, but from a total lack of mental will. They would stand in the fields and simply forget to move, their minds having been harvested of the very concept of the future. The informative records from the company's regional governors are filled with panic. They realized that by stealing the dreams of the people, they had destroyed the motor that drove the economy. You cannot have a market without people who want things, and you cannot want things if you cannot imagine a better life. The company had been so successful in their theft that they had accidentally abolished desire itself. They had created a world of perfect, empty obedience, only to find that such a world is a graveyard. In London, the directors were forced to confront the moral decay of their own making. The bleed, the feedback of collective trauma we have discussed, was now unstoppable. The silver jars in the architecture of the void were leaking a psychic static that made it impossible for anyone in the building to think clearly. The boardroom became a place of madness. where men discussed the price of tea while reliving the executions of their own ancestors. The system was eating itself, the harvested energy turning into a poison that infected every layer of the corporation. The response from the crown was a series of secret edicts intended to reset the population. They began to phase out the resonance rods and replace the blue poppy extract with a different, less invasive sedative. They realized that the famine was too dangerous to continue, not because it was immoral, but because it was unsustainable. They needed a population that was just conscious enough to be productive, but not so hollowed out that they stopped functioning altogether. This was the birth of the modern workplace, a compromise between the total theft of the soul and the need for a functioning society. The psychological layer of this story ends with a profound sense of unresolved loss. The dreams that were stolen in 1842 were never returned. The vitality that was auctioned off in the gentlemen's clubs was consumed and dissipated, leaving a permanent deficit in the collective subconscious. We are the descendants of a world that was starved of its spirit, and we still carry that hunger in our bones. We still feel that unexplainable exhaustion, that sense that something essential is missing from the air we breathe. The informative depth of this history serves as a warning. The East India Company proved that the human mind is a resource that can be exploited, but they also proved that such exploitation has a limit. There is a point where the spirit simply refuses to go further, where the vacuum becomes too great and the reality collapses. The famine of 1842 was a dress rehearsal for a world where everything is a commodity, and the only thing left to own is the silence of a broken soul. As you lie here, safe in the rhythmic stillness of your own room, feel the abundance of your own internal world. Your dreams, however strange or fragmented, are the evidence of your survival. They are the proof that you have not been harvested, that you are not a unit of productivity on a corporate ledger. The night is your sanctuary, a place where the famine cannot reach you, provided you guard the gates. The candle is flickering now, its light a soft golden pulse against the shadows. The archives of the psychological famine are closing, their heavy vellum pages settling into a long, quiet sleep. The story of the dream thieves is a part of the past, a dark lesson that helps us appreciate the light of our own awareness. You are whole, you are here, and you are free to drift into the deep, restorative waters of a natural rest. The air in the room is clean and cool, free of the indigo vapor and the psychic hum of the company's machine. The silence is no longer a void. It is a space for you to fill with your own peace. The history of the soul starters is a reminder that we must value the intangible above the material, that our capacity to dream is the most precious thing we possess. Breathe in the stillness. Let the weight of the story fall away, and let the natural rhythm of your own heart be your guide. You are moving toward a place where the logic of the market does not exist, a place of infinite depth and color. The night is a gift, a time for the soul to heal and the mind to renew itself. You are protected, you are safe, and the famine is over. The records of 1842 are locked away. Their secrets known to you, but their power over you broken. You have looked into the heart of the corporate machine and seen the emptiness within, and in doing so, you have reclaimed your own fullness. The world is at rest, and so are you. Let the darkness be your comfort, and the silence be your song. But as the company's governors were tearing down the resonance rods and burning the soul ledgers, one man remained at the center of the storm, unable to close his eyes. Lord Alistair Thorne, the architect of the harvest, had found that his own mind had become a permanent resonant chamber for every dream he had ever stolen. He was the master of 1,000,000 lives, yet he was a prisoner of a single eternal waking moment. The secret of the governor's insomnia was the final, terrifying price of the company's greed, and its shadows were about to stretch across the ocean to a new and unsuspecting continent dot in the high-ceilinged, humid chambers of the British Residency in Calcutta. There lived a man who had forgotten the meaning of darkness. Sir Edward Sterling was the East India Company's most decorated administrator, the man responsible for the logistical perfection of the silent harvest. But behind the official portraits and the medals of honor lay a terrifying secret that the company spent a fortune to suppress. Sir Edward had not closed his eyes in over 3 years. This was the governor's insomnia, a forbidden consequence of his own greed. He had become addicted to a refined, high-pressure version of the dream essence, a golden tonic he believed would grant him the intellect of a god. Instead, it became his curse. His optic nerves had become permanently stained by the stolen light of 1,000,000 souls. Every time he tried to lower his eyelids, the faces of the people he had robbed, the weavers, the farmers, the children would ignite against the back of his mind like a frantic, unending cinema. This was a profound betrayal of his own humanity, a moral decay that turned his brain into a resonant chamber for the grief of an entire continent. The world was told he suffered from a tropical fever, but the truth was far more sinister. He was a prisoner of the light he had stolen. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe in the heavy, warm air of the midnight residency. Feel the stillness of the sprawling estate as the rest of the world falls into a natural, easy sleep. We are stepping into the private quarters of a man who is wide awake, surrounded by the shadows of a history that refuses to rest. Sir Edward Sterling was a man of shadows and silver. His office was a sanctuary of cold, calculated logic, where the maps on the walls showed the movement of more than just tea and spices. They showed the flow of human vitality. In the early days of the 1840s, Sterling was the architect of the Soul Ledger's most efficient expansion. He was the one who authorized the placement of the resonance rods in the most sacred sites of the East, believing that the spiritual energy of those locations would enhance the quality of the harvest. He was a man who prided himself on his detachment. To Sterling, the millions of subjects under his rule were not people. They were biological batteries. He wrote in his private diaries that the human subconscious was a wasted resource, a garden of energy that was left to rot every night. He believed it was his duty as a servant of the empire to industrialize this garden. This was the ideological rot at his core, a belief that progress required the total sacrifice of the individual's internal life. As the harvest grew, so did Sterling's personal ambition. He began to experiment on himself, using a specialized inhalation device made of silver and crystal. Every night, before the sunset, he would breathe in a concentrated dose of the primary essence. At first, the results were miraculous. He found that he needed only an hour of sleep to feel completely rejuvenated. His mind became a sharp, brilliant instrument, capable of processing complex economic data and political strategies with a speed that left his subordinates in awe. He felt like a titan among men, a pioneer of a new human evolution, but the informative reality of his condition was far more complex. The alchemists in the company's hidden labs had warned him about the refractive limit. They explained that the human brain can only hold so much external light before the neural pathways begin to calcify. Sterling ignored them. He believed he was the exception to the rule. He increased the dosage, searching for a level of clarity that would allow him to see the future of the markets themselves. The first sign of the curse appeared in the summer of 1842. Sterling noticed that the shadows in his room were beginning to move independently of the light. When he blinked, he saw flashes of blue and violet, the same colors as the indigo fog. He dismissed these as temporary ocular strains. But then came the night he could no longer close his eyes. He found that the muscles in his eyelids had become rigid, locked in a state of permanent tension. Even more terrifying was the realization that darkness no longer existed for him. Even in a pitch-black room, his vision was filled with a soft, pulsing luminescence. This was the beginning of his personal collapse. He began to see the faces of the harvested villagers not as distant memories, but as immediate presences. They would appear on the walls and the patterns of the rugs, and most vividly on the inside of his eyelids. They didn't speak. They simply stared at him with the hollow eye syndrome he had helped create. They were a silent jury, witnessing the decay of the man who had stolen their nights. Sterling was no longer the master of the harvest. He had become its ultimate victim, a vessel for the collective trauma he had orchestrated. As the clock in the residency hallway strikes 2 a.m, the governor sits in his high-backed chair, his eyes wide and burning with a light that does not belong to the sun. The informative depth of Sterling's medical logs during this period is a testament to the horror of his existence. The residency physicians, bound by oaths of secrecy, recorded that his brain was functioning at a frequency that was physically impossible for a human being. He was processing information at 20 times the normal rate, but he was no longer processing reality. He was processing the stolen identities stored within the soul ledger. The psychological layer of his insomnia was a descent into a fragmented consciousness. Because the dream essence he consumed was a mixture of thousands of different lives, Sterling's own identity began to dissolve. He would find himself weeping for a lost harvest in a village he had never visited. He would experience the sudden, sharp grief of a mother he had never met. He was no longer Sir Edward Sterling. He was a mosaic of the Empire's victims. This was the ultimate moral decay, a man who had tried to become a god and instead became a ghost of his own making. Sterling's residency became a place of ritualistic madness. He had the windows of his bedroom painted black to keep out the natural light. Yet the room was always filled with the ghostly violet glow of his own vision. He surrounded himself with clocks, believing that the rhythmic ticking would give his mind a structure to hold on to. But the clocks only served to remind him of the seconds, minutes, and hours of sleep he would never again experience. He was a man suspended in time, a living specimen of the company's hubris. The informative details of his treatment reveal the desperation of the company. They brought in alchemists from across the globe to try and drain the excess light from his mind. They used copper headdresses and silver ear cones designed to act as grounding wires for the psychic energy. But the light was not just in his brain. It was in his soul. It had become a part of his biological makeup. The alchemists realized that to remove the light would be to remove the man himself. Sterling was a permanent resonant chamber, a biological extension of the architecture of the void. Think about the atmosphere of his interactions with the outside world. To his staff, he appeared as a terrifying, spectral figure. He spoke in a low, resonant hum, his words often overlapping as if multiple people were speaking through him at once. He rarely ate, for he found that the dream essence provided all the energy he needed. He became a creature of pure cognitive function, devoid of any physical desire or human warmth. He was the perfect corporate administrator, a machine of flesh and bone that never stopped working, never stopped thinking, and never stopped suffering. The moral decay of the company officials who observed him was equally profound. Instead of seeing Sterling's condition as a warning, they saw it as a data point. They continued to harvest the essence even as they watched their governor lose his mind. They were more concerned with the stability of the soul ledger than the stability of the man who managed it. They believed that Sterling's collapse was a small price to pay for the secrets they were extracting from the collective subconscious. They were already looking for his successor, someone who would be more durable. In the face of the refractive limit, Sterling's final days in the residency were marked by a total withdrawal from reality. He stopped issuing orders and instead spent his time writing in the soul ledger itself. But he wasn't writing numbers or names. He was writing the dreams he was seeing on the back of his eyelids. He was trying to transcribe the internal world of 1 million people, a task that was as impossible as it was tragic. He was attempting to give back through ink what he had taken through alchemy. But the pages remained a chaotic mess of symbols and screams as you listened to the rhythmic pulse of your own breath. Consider the silence of Sterling's world. It was a silence filled with the noise of 1,000 lives. It was a stillness that was never quiet. He was the only person in the world who could see the true cost of the Empire's progress. He saw the threads of energy that connected every silver jar in the vaults to every human heart in the colonies. He saw the web of betrayal and greed that held the world together. And he saw that the web was beginning to break under its own weight. By the autumn of 1845, Sir Edward Sterling was no longer a man. He was a biological monument to the company's sins. The informative records of his final collapse describe a scene that seems more like a nightmare than a historical event. One morning, the staff found the governor standing in the center of the residency's great hall. He was staring directly at the rising sun, his eyes wide and unblinking. He didn't flinch as the light hit his pupils. He simply stood there, his body vibrating with a low, metallic hum that shattered the glass in the nearby windows. The moral decay had finally reached its ultimate conclusion. Sterling's mind had become so saturated with the stolen essence that it was physically reacting to the natural light of the world. The alchemists believed that he was experiencing a total refraction, a state where the internal and external worlds collide. To Sterling, the sun was not a star. It was a mirror reflecting every dream he had ever harvested back into his own brain. The pain must have been unimaginable, yet he stood there in a state of ecstatic, horrific clarity. The psychological layer of this moment was the final dissolution of the self. In those last moments, Sterling reportedly spoke the names of every person listed in the first volume of the Soul Ledger. He spoke them with a voice that was not his own, a voice that carried the weight of 1,000 different accents and 1,000,000 different histories. He was the mouthpiece for the stolen spirit of the East. He was testifying to his own crimes. His words a rhythmic, hypnotic litany of the forbidden's truth. The company acted quickly to contain the situation. They cleared the hall and had Sterling moved to a secret facility in the mountains, far from the prying eyes of the public. They burned his journals, destroyed his inhalation devices, and declared that he had died of a sudden, virulent strain of cholera. But the informative reality is that Sterling did not die. He was kept in a state of suspended animation, his body used as a permanent, resonant anchor for the global network of resonance rods. He became a living part of the architecture of the void. a governor who would rule the night forever from a state of eternal wakefulness. Think about the atmosphere of that mountain cell. It was a room made of lead and silver, designed to keep the light of his mind from leaking out into the world. There, in the absolute silence of the peaks, Sterling remains, his eyes forever open, his mind forever full. He is the guardian of the ledger, the man who knows the weight of every soul the company ever took. He is the ultimate prisoner of the empire, a man who cannot even find the mercy of a dream to hide in. The moral decay of the company continued long after Sterling was hidden away. They used the data from his collapse to refine the Blue Poppy protocol, making it more subtle and less likely to cause a total refraction in the administrators. They learned how to harvest the spirit without breaking the vessel, but they never forgot the man who showed them the limit. Sterling's name became a whisper, a warning among the elite of the boardroom. They called it Sterling's light, a state of brilliance that leads only to the void. As the night air in your room grows still and the story reaches its end, reflect on the value of your own rest. The story of the governor's insomnia is a reminder that there are things in this world that are not meant to be harvested. There is a weight to every life we touch and a debt for every dream we take. Sterling tried to carry the weight of an empire's greed, and it crushed him into a state of permanent, haunted wakefulness. He is the ghost that watches over the ledgers, the silent witness to the trade in the invisible. The informative depth of this history is meant to protect you. It is a shield against the hubris of a world that thinks everything can be measured and sold. Your sleep is your own. Your darkness is a sanctuary that no governor can occupy. The light in your mind is your own natural brilliance, not a stolen essence that will eventually turn to poison. You are the master of your own internal hall of mirrors. And the images you see there are the reflections of your own beautiful, uncatalogued life. The candle in the residency has finally burned out, leaving the governor in the light of his own making. The clocks have stopped their ticking, and the humid air of Calcutta has been replaced by the cool, fresh breeze of the present. You are here, you are safe, and you are whole. The story of Sir Edward Sterling is a dark chapter in a book that is now being closed. The weight of his stolen lives is a burden you do not have to carry. Breathe in the deep, natural silence of the night. It is a silence that is truly quiet, a stillness that is truly restful. There are no faces on the back of your eyelids, no humming in your chest, and no resonance in your mind. There is only the soft, steady rhythm of your own heart, beating in a world that respects the boundaries of the soul. You are moving toward the edge of a deep, dark ocean, where you can sink into the waters of a perfect, natural sleep. The archives are closing now, the heavy leather covers settling into place with a soft, final thud. The secrets of the East India Company are safe in the darkness of history, and you are safe in the light of your own awareness. The governor is wide awake in his mountain cell, but you are free to close your eyes. You are free to let go of the day and let the darkness take you where it will. But even as Sterling's cell was being sealed, a new discovery was made in the very basement of the East India House. The scribes had found a series of entries in the soul ledger that they couldn't explain, names that appeared in the future tense, records of harvests that hadn't happened yet. The company had discovered a way to harvest not just the present, but the potential of what was yet to come. The secret of the Great Erasure was about to reveal how the Empire attempted to rewrite the very timeline of human history. In the flickering shadows of 1858, a massive bonfire was lit in the courtyard of East India House, but it was not fueled by coal or wood. It was fueled by the collective memory of an entire century. As the flames licked the sky, thousands of leather-bound volumes were fed into the furnace, each one a forbidden record of the Soul Ledger and the Blue Poppy Protocol. This was the Great Erasure, the most elaborate betrayal in human history. The British Empire realized that the evidence of their psychological theft was too dangerous to keep. They burned the truth to plant a lie. They replaced the records of stolen dreams with mundane lists of tea, silk, and spices. They turned a metaphysical curse into a commercial transaction. Every modern history book you have ever read is a product of this smoke. The world was forced into a state of selective amnesia, programmed to believe that the company was merely a trading firm rather than a predatory architect of the human spirit. They buried the jars, they silenced the alchemists, and they executed the scribes who knew the true weight of the empire's greed. This was not just a fire. It was the murder of a century's conscience. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe in the cool, dry stillness of the archive. Feel the weight of the silence as we walk through the halls of 1858, where the smell of burning ink and old leather still hangs in the atmosphere. The world is soft, the shadows are long, and the secrets are ready to be unraveled. The year 1858 was not just the end of the East India Company. It was the beginning of a manufactured reality. Following the chaos of the Great Mutiny, the British Crown realized that the corporate experiment in soul harvesting had become a liability. The resonance rods were being pulled from the earth, and the silver jars were being emptied into the sea. But the most difficult task remained: the sanitization of history itself. A team of elite linguists and archival specialists was assembled in a windowless room beneath Whitehall. Their mission was to rewrite every ledger, every letter, and every manifest from the previous 100 years. This was a task of surgical precision. They developed a complex system of substitution. When a ledger mentioned the extraction of refined subconscious energy, it was rewritten as the purchase of rare Himalayan tea. When a ship's manifest listed silver canisters of dream essence, it was changed to crates of indigo dye or fine silk. The terminology of the soul trade was systematically replaced by the language of the spice trade. The informative depth of our current history is actually a hollow shell, a vocabulary of commerce designed to mask a history of psychological colonization. As you listen to the rhythmic pulse of the night, imagine the scribes at their desks, their pens scratching across the vellum by candlelight. They were erasing the existence of millions of stolen nights. They were deleting the records of the hollow eye syndrome and the Blue Poppy Protocol. They were making sure that when future generations looked back, they would see only a story of economic expansion and administrative challenges. The moral decay of this erasure is staggering. It was the ultimate theft, the theft of the truth. They were not just stealing the past. They were ensuring that the future could never understand what had been lost. Consider the psychological atmosphere of London during this transition. The city was moving from a state of indigo fog into a state of historical fog. The public was encouraged to forget the unexplained illnesses and the nightly hum that had characterized the previous decades. The newspapers were filled with stories of a new, enlightened era of direct rule under the Queen. The darkness was being pushed into the basement, tucked away in climate-controlled vaults where the light of inquiry could not reach it. The empire was rebranding itself, shifting from a predatory corporation to a benevolent guardian, all while the embers of the truth were still cooling in the courtyard. The informative reality of the Great Erasure can be found in the subtle inconsistencies that remain in the official archives. If you look closely at the trade figures from the mid-19th century, the numbers do not add up. The volume of tea reported as imported into London far exceeds the capacity of the plantations in India and China. This is because tea was the code word for the harvested dream essence. The varying grades of tea pico, souchong, and oolong were actually classifications for the quality of the subconscious energy. The public was drinking a mundane leaf, unaware that the elite were still consuming the vital trace behind closed doors. The architecture of the lie was global. In Calcutta and Bombay, the local administrative offices were purged. Thousands of clerks were given pensions and sworn to silence, while the physical evidence of the resonance rods was melted down and recast as structural beams for new government buildings. The very iron and copper that had once siphoned the dreams of the people were now supporting the roofs over their heads. It was a structural irony that only the architects of the erasure could appreciate. They had turned the tools of the curse into the symbols of progress. Why did they feel the need for such total secrecy? The answer lies in the fear of a global psychological awakening. If the people of the world realized that their very spirits had been used as a commodity, the resulting revolution would have been unstoppable. The British Crown understood that the only way to maintain the empire was to make the subjects believe that their exhaustion and their lack of imagination were natural. They had to convince the world that the great stillness was a cultural trait rather than a corporate symptom. The erasure was a defensive measure, a way to protect the ruling class from the consequences of their own moral decay. As you lie in the quiet of the present, think about the power of a written word to shape a reality. For over a century, the narrative of tea and spices has stood unchallenged. We have been taught to see the East India Company as a group of merchants who got carried away by power, rather than a group of alchemists who sought to industrialize the human soul. The informative depth of the story has been flattened, turned into a safe, predictable history that we can read without losing our sleep. But the shadows remain in the margins. They remain in the missing months of 1888 and the unexplained behavior of the colonial governors. The psychological layer of the erasure is perhaps its most lasting legacy. By deleting the history of the harvest, the empire ensured that the victims could never name their trauma. A person who feels hollow but does not know why is a person who is easy to manage. They attribute their fatigue to the weather or their own failings. They never suspect that they are the descendants of a world that was systematically hollowed out. The erasure was not just about burning paper. It was about burning the bridge between the self and its own history. It was the final, most efficient act of the soul ledger. The scribes who performed this work were themselves victims of a specific type of memory wipe. The company utilized a refined version of the erase extract to ensure that even the men who rewrote history would eventually forget what they had written. They were biological erasers, living for a few years in a state of high-focus productivity before fading into a quiet, dreamless retirement. They died in the suburbs of London, their minds as blank as the ledgers they had helped to sanitize. The secret was held by fewer and fewer people until it became a ghost, a whisper in the corridors of power that no one dared to speak aloud. As the night reaches its deepest point and the air in our room becomes a cool, protective shroud, we must ask, did the great erasure succeed? On the surface, the answer is yes. The world has forgotten the resonance rods and the silver jars. We look at the Victorian era as a time of steam and steel, of rigid social codes and grand imperial projects. We do not see the indigo vapor or the soul ledgers. But the informative truth is that you cannot burn a spirit without leaving a residue. The smoke of the 1858 bonfire still hangs over our modern world, a subtle, invisible haze that colors our perception of history. The residue can be found in the museums of London and the private collections of the elite. There are objects, there are glass retorts, copper headdresses, and silver-lined boxes that are labeled as ritual curiosities or scientific oddities. They are the physical remnants of a technology that we no longer have the vocabulary to describe. They are the artifacts of a forgotten science, waiting for someone to recognize their true purpose. The moral decay of the empire is preserved in these objects, a cold, metallic vibration that can still be felt by those who are sensitive to the frequencies of the past. Think about the silence of our history books. That silence is not a void. It is a construction. It is a wall built of carefully chosen words and omitted details. The informative depth of our education is limited by the boundaries of the Great Erasure. We are allowed to know about the taxes on tea, but not the taxes on sleep. We are allowed to know about the trade in silk, but not the trade in memory. The empire may be gone, but the narrative it constructed still governs our understanding of the world. We are still living in the official version of reality, a world where the soul is a metaphor rather than a resource. As you breathe in the natural stillness of the night, recognize the value of your own awareness. By hearing this story, you are beginning to pierce the fog of the erasure. You are reclaiming the pieces of a history that was supposed to be lost forever. The fire in 1858 was meant to be the end of the story, but the truth is like the blue poppy. It can grow in the most inhospitable soil, and it can bloom in the deepest darkness. The secret is out, and in knowing it, you are no longer a subject of the manufactured past, the moral decay of the company, and the crown was a betrayal of the human spirit. But your capacity to remember is a form of resistance. The night is a time for the truth to resurface, for the shadows to tell their side of the story. The Great Erasure tried to make us all forget, but the subconscious is a vast, unburnable archive. Every stolen dream, every harvested thought, and every silenced voice still exists in the deep layers of our collective mind. We only need to listen to the silence to hear them. The candle is now a tiny point of light, a star in the darkness of the room. The history of the erasure is closing, its sanitized pages being replaced by the vibrant, messy truth of the human experience. You are whole, you are awake, and you are free from the weight of the lie. The smoke has cleared and the air is fresh and new. The night belongs to the truth, and the truth belongs to you. The world outside is quiet, and the only sound is the gentle pulse of the present moment. You are safe in the sanctuary of your own mind, a place where no scribe can rewrite your history and no fire can burn your memories. The East India Company is a ruin, and the soul ledger is a ghost, but you are a living, breathing reality. Your rest is sacred, and your dreams are your own. The history of the invisible has been told, and the silence that follows is a piece that no empire can take away. But even as the last of the vellum burned and the courtyard was swept clean, a single silver jar was found hidden in the Thames mud, its seal still intact. It was not a jar of tea or a jar of spices, but something the alchemists called a feedback loop. It contained the final, unprocessed grief of a million souls, and it was beginning to hum with a frequency that threatened to wake the entire city of London from its manufactured slumber. The secret of the ghosts of the Thames was about to reveal that some things simply refused to stay buried. In the winter of 1858, the fog of London began to scream. This was not the whistle of the wind through the alleyways or the hiss of the gaslight. It was the sound of a million stolen memories breaking free from their silver prisons beneath Leadenhall Street. The East India Company had spent decades harvesting the subconscious vitality of an entire continent, but their architecture of the void was never designed to hold the weight of such profound, concentrated grief. As the lead-lined vaults began to corrode and the glass retorts began to crack, the primary essence began to seep into the city's water table and rise through the sewer grates. The fog that blanketed the Victorian capital was no longer just coal smoke and moisture. It was a shifting, violet-tinted shroud of the damned. People walking through the mist began to see faces they did not recognize and hear languages they had never learned. It was a global haunting brought home to the very heart of the empire. This was the ultimate betrayal of the human condition, a moral decay where the stolen spirits of the East returned to claim the nights of their masters. The company tried to call it a public health crisis, but the elite knew the truth. Their vaults were leaking souls. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe in the cool, damp stillness of the riverside. Let the world outside fade away as we stand on the banks of the Thames, where the water is dark and the secrets are rising. The year is 1858, and the silence of the night is about to be broken by a billion whispers. To understand the ghosts of the Thames, one must first visualize the physical decay of the Leadenhall vaults. For years, the company had maintained an artificial vacuum, a structural lie that held the subconscious energy of millions in a state of suspended animation. But the human spirit is not a static resource. It is a living, pulsing frequency. By 1858, the pressure within the silver jars had reached a critical mass. The alchemical seals, once thought to be unbreakable, were beginning to fail under the weight of the collective sorrow they contained. The first signs of the leak appeared in the basements of the buildings surrounding the East India House. Residents began to report a strange, luminescent mold growing on their walls, a substance that glowed with a faint indigo light. This was not a fungus, but the physical residue of the refined dream essence reacting to the moisture of the London soil. Wherever this mold appeared, the atmosphere of the room changed. People felt a sudden, heavy sadness, a sense of loss for things they could not name. They were breathing in the filtered grief of 1,000 distant villages. The informative depth of the company's private logs from this period reveals a state of total panic. The scribes, those hollowed-out men who managed the sole ledger, were the first to be consumed. As the essence leaked into their workrooms, they began to lose the ability to differentiate between their own thoughts and the entries in the ledger. They would stop writing in mid-sentence, their eyes fixed on the shadows, speaking the names of the dead as if they were standing in the room. They were the first victims of the feedback loop, the process where the harvested energy returns to its source, but with a vengeance. Think about the atmosphere of the Thames at midnight. The river was always a place of secrets, a dark artery flowing through the heart of the empire. But in 1858, the river began to breathe. A thick, viscous mist rose from the water, a mist that did not dissipate with the morning sun. It stayed, clinging to the bridges and the hulls of the ships. This was the concentrated leakage from the vaults, channeled through the ancient tunnels that Lord Alistair Thorne had built. The river had become a medium for the transmission of the stolen spirits. The psychological layer of this haunting was a slow burn horror. It did not start with ghosts in white sheets. It started with a change in the way people felt. A dock worker in Wapping would suddenly feel the warmth of a tropical sun on his face while standing in the freezing rain. A merchant in the city would find himself humming a melody from a Bengali lullaby he had never heard. The boundaries of the self were becoming porous, dissolved by the violet fog that was now a permanent part of the London landscape. The empire was being haunted not by individuals, but by a collective subconscious that was demanding to be heard. As the fog deepened, the moral decay of the company became visible to anyone who knew where to look. The board of directors authorized the use of acoustic dampeners, massive bronze instruments installed along the river banks that were intended to neutralize the frequency of the leaking souls. They were trying to silence the dead with the same science they had used to harvest the living, but the dampeners only made the situation worse. The vibrations they produced caused the indigo fog to coalesce into semi-solid forms, ghostly silhouettes that moved through the streets with a slow, rhythmic grace. The informative archives from the Royal Society, though heavily censored, described these forms as atmospheric echoes. They were not sentient beings, but visual recordings of the most intense moments of the stolen dreams. A woman in a silk sari would be seen walking through a market in Spitalfields, her image flickering like a dying candle. A group of children would be seen playing in the mud of the Thames, their laughter sounding like the tinkling of broken glass. These were the ghosts of the East India Company's greed, manifested in the very air of the capital. The elite, who had spent years consuming the refined essence, were the most vulnerable to these echoes, because their own mental pathways had been widened by the blue poppy extract. They could not block out the sensory influx. They were forced to witness the reality of their investments every time they stepped outside. The gentlemen's clubs were filled with men staring at the walls, their hands trembling as they watched the flickering images of the lives they had helped to destroy. This was the psychological famine reaching its climax, a state where the harvesters were being consumed by the harvest. Consider the atmosphere of a Victorian bedroom during the Great Leak. Even behind closed doors and heavy curtains, the violet fog found a way in. It crept through the keyholes and under the floorboards, filling the rooms with a faint, metallic scent. Families would wake up in the middle of the night, all of them having shared the same vision of a burning village or a silent field. They were being force-fed the truth that the Great Erasure had tried to hide. The collective memory of the colonies was being downloaded into the minds of the British public, one night at a time. The moral decay of the government's response was a masterpiece of misdirection. They hired fog clearers, men who walked the streets with bellows and chemical sprays, claiming to be cleaning the air of industrial pollutants. In reality, they were spraying a diluted version of the erase extract, trying to induce a state of localized amnesia in anyone who had seen too much. They were trying to fight the haunting with more alchemy, a desperate attempt to maintain the lie of 1842. But the spirits of the East were not so easily suppressed. Every time the chemicals cleared a patch of fog, the indigo would return with even greater intensity, glowing with a fierce, unnatural light. The informative reality of this period is that London was on the verge of a total psychological collapse. The city's infrastructure was failing as the feedback interfered with the telegraph lines and the new gas systems. The very air had become a conductor for grief, and the weight of it was becoming unbearable. People began to abandon their homes near the river, fleeing to the suburbs where the air was still clean. But even there, the whispers followed. The Soul Ledger was no longer a book. It was an atmosphere to think about the silence of the company's board meetings during this time. There were no more discussions of profit or expansion. There was only the sound of the indigo fog pressing against the windows and the low, constant hum of the vaults below. The directors knew that their time was up. They had created a machine that they could no longer control, and the machine was now eating the world. They sat in their leather chairs, surrounded by the ghosts of their success, waiting for the final breach. The psychological layer of the story reaches its peak with the discovery of the primary leak beneath the Waterloo Bridge. Divers found a massive crack in the bedrock, a crack that was pulsing with a brilliant violet light. This was the source of the haunting, a wound in the earth itself where the architecture of the void had finally given way. The diverted spirits were not just leaking into the fog, they were leaking back into the very fabric of reality. The East India Company had managed to puncture the veil between the worlds, and the result was a slow-burn horror that no history book has ever dared to describe. By the end of 1858. The ghosts of the Thames had become an undeniable presence in the life of the city. The informative records from the final days of the East India Company describe a world where the sun never fully rose, and the night never truly ended. The Indigo Fog had created a state of permanent twilight, a visual representation of the empire's moral decay. The people of London had adapted to the hauntings, walking through the echoes of the East with a stoic, hollow-eyed acceptance. They had become part of the network, their own subconscious minds acting as auxiliary storage for the leaking essence. The final betrayal occurred when the company realized they could not stop the leak. Instead of warning the public, they began to prepare for the final extraction. They intended to use the remaining energy in the vaults to create a massive, singular erase that would wipe the memory of the entire city. They wanted to start again, to build a new world on the ashes of the old one. But the spirits of the East had other plans. At the moment, the alchemists activated the final resonant chamber. The primary leak beneath the bridge exploded with a force that was felt in every corner of the capital. The result was not a memory wipe, but a memory flood. For 1 hour, every person in London experienced the full, unedited contents of the Soul Ledger. They saw every face, felt every grief, and remembered every betrayal of the previous century. It was a moment of total, terrifying clarity. The moral decay of the empire was laid bare for all to see. The elite and the poor, the harvesters and the harvested, were briefly united in a single, overwhelming experience of the truth. This was the true end of the East India Company, a collapse that was not economic or political, but spiritual. The informative reality of the aftermath is that the company was dissolved almost immediately. The crown took over the assets, but the vaults were never truly repaired. They were simply filled with concrete and lead, buried under layers of new construction. The indigo fog slowly dissipated, or so the newspapers claimed. But if you walk along the Thames today, in the quiet hours before dawn, you can still feel that old, heavy stillness. You can still see a hint of violet in the mist, and if you listen closely, you can still hear the whispers of the lives that were stolen and never returned. The psychological layer of this story is a reminder that the truth is never truly buried. It merely waits for the right frequency to emerge. The ghosts of the Thames are still there, anchored to the river and the stone, a permanent part of the city's subconscious. They are a warning about the cost of building an empire on the foundation of a stolen spirit. They are the evidence of a debt that has never been paid, a deficit of rest that still haunts our nights, as you lie here in the safety of the present. Let the rhythm of the river be your guide. The water flows on, carrying the memories of the past toward a vast open sea. You are no longer part of the leak. You are no longer a node in the network. The indigo fog has cleared, and the air you breathe is clean and light. The secrets of the Leadenhall vaults are a dark piece of history, a lesson in the fragility of a world built on lies. The candle in our room is burning low, its light a soft, golden pulse against the shadows. The archives of the ghosts of the Thames are closing, the heavy leather covers settling into place with a quiet, final thud. The haunting is over for tonight, and the silence that remains is a space for you to fill with your own peace. You are whole, you are here, and you are free to drift into the deep. Restorative waters of a natural rest. The night is a sanctuary, a place where the shadows are just shadows and the whispers are just the wind. The moral decay of the past has been acknowledged, and its power over you is broken. You are moving toward a world where the soul is not a commodity and the subconscious is not a ledger. The river is quiet, the city is still, and you are safe in the embrace of the deep. But as the concrete was being poured into the Leadenhall vaults, a single golden ledger was smuggled out of the building by a man who had seen the final extraction. This was not a book of names, but a book of debts, a record of the interest that had accrued on the stolen souls of the East. The company may have been dissolved, but the debt remained, and it was being transferred to a new, even more powerful entity that lived in the shadows of the royal courts. The secret of the eternal debt was about to reveal that the harvest was far from over. The history books claim the East India Company died in 1858, dissolved by an act of Parliament and buried under the weight of its own administrative failures. They are lying to you. A corporation that had learned to harvest the human soul does not simply vanish. It evolves. The Great Erasure was successful in burning the paper ledgers, but it could not erase the spiritual deficit that had been carved into the collective subconscious of the world. Today, when you wake up at 3 a.m. with a crushing sense of exhaustion that sleep cannot fix, you are not suffering from modern stress. You are paying the interest on an eternal debt. The soul ledger was never balanced. It was merely moved to a different vault. This is the ultimate betrayal, a forbidden truth that links the alchemists of Victorian London to the digital architects of the modern age. We are living in a world that was hollowed out over a century ago, and the vacuum left behind is what we now call burnout. The curse of the Blue Poppy Protocol has not faded. It has simply changed its color from indigo to the blue light of the screens that watch us while we rest. This is a secret buried so deep that it has become the very air we breathe. A lie that keeps us running on a treadmill of stolen vitality. This is the truth the king buried. Now, let us turn back the pages of the years for the final time. The light is dim, the chamber is quiet, and the scent of aged parchment fills the air. Breathe in the cool, heavy stillness of the present moment. Let the world outside your window fade into a soft, distant hum. We are standing at the edge of the archive, looking out over a century of shadows. The candle is flickering, the ink is dry, And the story is reaching its conclusion in the rhythmic silence of the night. To understand the eternal debt, we must look at the legacy of the architecture of the void. When the vaults beneath Leadenhall Street were filled with concrete, the energy they contained was not destroyed. It was displaced. The refined subconscious essence of millions of people was pushed back into the soil of London and out through the trade routes of the world. It became a permanent part of the human inheritance. We are born into a state of cognitive debt inherited from ancestors, whose nights were sold to fuel the industrial expansion of the West. The informative reality of this debt is found in the way we perceive time. Before the 1840s, time was a fluid natural rhythm. After the soul ledger, time became a commodity. We feel the pressure to be productive every second of every day because the collective subconscious is still trying to fill the void that the company created. We are the biological laborers in an experiment that never ended. The East India Company proved that the human spirit could be industrialized, and that knowledge was passed down from the board of directors to the modern masters of the market. Think about the atmosphere of your own exhaustion. It is a heavy, weighted feeling, much like the one described by the victims of the silent harvest. It is a feeling of being siphoned, of having your mental vitality pulled toward a center you cannot see. This is the lingering echo of the resonance rods. While the physical copper pillars are gone, the psychological pathways they created remain open. They are the invisible veins of the modern world, channeling our attention and our dreams toward the new ledgers of the global economy. The moral decay of this system is that it has become invisible. We no longer see the silver jars or the indigo fog, so we assume they no longer exist. But the decay is present in the way we treat our own rest. We view sleep as a weakness, a period of lost productivity that must be minimized. This is exactly the mindset that Lord Alistair Thorne cultivated in his boardroom. We have become our own harvesters, siphoning our own spirits to meet the demands of a world built on a stolen foundation. We are living in the shadow of a corporate heist that has lasted for over 180 years. As we sit in the quiet of this room, we must ask ourselves, who are the current shareholders of the soul ledger? The informative archives of the Great Erasure suggest that the assets were transferred to the Crown. But the reality is that they were distributed among the families and institutions that have ruled the world since the Victorian era. The wealth of the modern world is not just in gold and data. It is in the mental surplus that has been accumulating for generations. There are secret societies and corporate entities that still understand the science of the blue poppy, using it to maintain their own clarity and power at the expense of the collective rest of humanity, the psychological layer of the eternal. That is the feeling that we are never quite enough. No matter how much we achieve, no matter how much we rest, there is a sense of a fundamental deficit. This is because the spirit of the board, that liquid mind created in the Leadenhall reservoirs, is still being fed. It has evolved into the global algorithms that manage our desires and our fears. It is a predatory consciousness that requires a constant influx of human attention to sustain itself. Every time you feel the compulsion to check your phone in the middle of the night, you are being harvested. You are a node in the network, providing the raw material for a system that was designed in a London basement in 1842. Consider the atmosphere of the modern night. We have banished the darkness with artificial light, creating a world of perpetual twilight that mirrors the indigo fog. We have replaced the silence of the night with the constant hum of electricity and the flicker of digital signals. This is not progress. It is an atmospheric containment strategy. By keeping the world in a state of constant sensory input, the masters of the ledger ensure that our subconscious never has the chance to fully recover. We are kept in the hollow eye state, productive enough to function, but too tired to dream of a world outside the market. The informative depth of this history reveals that the governor's insomnia was just the first case of a global condition. We are a world that has forgotten how to close its eyes. We are haunted by the faces of those we have never met and the grief of a history we have been taught to forget. The moral decay of the empire has become a global norm. We have traded the sanctuary of our own internal worlds for the convenience of a connected life, unaware that the connection is a siphoning tube. We are the heirs to a legacy of spiritual bankruptcy, trying to pay off a debt with a currency that is being stolen from us every single night. Why do we continue to support this system? The answer is found in the Blue Poppy Protocol. The extract was not just a tool for extraction. It was a tool for compliance. It created a world where the people themselves would defend the very structures that were robbing them. We believe in the necessity of the hustle, the importance of the growth, and the value of the market because these ideas have been broadcast into our subconscious for over a century. We are the curators of our own prison, the guardians of the very ledger that lists us as commodities. The betrayal is total because it has become internal. As you breathe in the steady rhythm of the night, think about the silence that remains. Despite the efforts of the alchemists and the scribes, there are still moments where the debt feels distant. There are moments of deep, uncatalogued peace that remind us of what we used to be. These are the fragments of the world before the ledger, the remnants of a natural rest that the company could never fully extinguish. They are the evidence that the debt is a construction, a lie that only has power as long as we believe in the ledger. By acknowledging the secret, we begin to withhold our interest. We begin to reclaim the vitality that was stolen from our lineage, the final informative truth of the lore. Slumber is that the East India Company did not win. They managed to harvest the past and mortgage the future, but they could never own the present moment. The Great Erasure was an admission of failure, a desperate attempt to hide the fact that the human spirit is too vast and too resilient to be contained in a silver jar. The ghosts of the Thames still whisper because they are alive. They are the proof that even the most refined extraction leaves the soul intact. The debt is eternal only if we choose to keep paying it. The psychological layer of this conclusion is a call to stillness. The only way to break the resonance of the rods and the pull of the ledger is to stop moving, to sit in the dim light of a single candle and breathe, to reclaim the darkness of the night as a sanctuary rather than a void. When we allow ourselves to truly rest, when we refuse to be productive for even a single hour, we are committing an act of rebellion against the architecture of the void. We are proving that our vitality is not for sale, and our dreams are not a commodity. We are returning to the state of natural abundance that existed before the first indigo poppy was planted. The moral decay of the world is a heavy weight, but it is a weight that we can set down. The history of the soul ledger is a dark mirror, showing us the worst of what we can be when we view one another as resources. But it also shows us the strength of our survival. We are still here, still dreaming, and still feeling the beauty of the world despite the fog. The East India Company and Lord Alistair Thorne are ghosts of a failed ambition, while you are a living, breathing reality. The file on the 1842 conspiracy is finally being closed. its secrets exposed and its power neutralized by the light of your awareness. Think about the atmosphere of this room now. It is no longer filled with the static of the ledger or the hum of the machine. It is filled with the simple, quiet presence of the night. The aged parchment has been put away, and the ink has long since turned to dust. The story of the trade in the invisible has reached its end. You have walked through the vaults, heard the auctioneer's gavel, and seen the light in the governor's eyes. You have heard the truth that the king buried, and in doing so, you have freed yourself from the shadow of the empire. The informative journey we have taken is a map of a world that tried to own itself and lost its soul in the process. But you have found something better. You have found the value of the quiet. The night is no longer a place of harvest. It is a place of restoration. The silence is no longer an empty void. It is a space for your own spirit to grow and flourish. The eternal debt is canceled, the ledger is burned, and the blue poppy has withered in the light of the morning. You are whole, you are free, and you are finally, truly, at rest. As you lie here in the safety of the present, let the last of the story fade away. The world outside is still, and the only sound is the gentle pulse of your own heart. The history of the dream thieves is a part of the past, a dark lesson that has been learned and set aside. You are the master of your own nights once more. Your dreams are coming, and they are entirely your own. They are the vibrant, uncatalogued treasures of a soul that refuses to be owned. The air in the room is clean and light. The shadows are soft and warm, and the bed is a sanctuary of total peace. There's no more interest to pay, no more hours to account for, and no more secrets to keep. The world is at peace, and so are you. Let the darkness be your comfort and the silence be your song. The weight of the world has lifted, leaving you in a state of perfect, natural grace. The story ends here, but your rest is just beginning. Sleep now. The file is closed.